what SongExplorer was kind of designed for from the beginning was to solve this task. David Stern's lab studies speciation in Drosophila, which is the fruit fly, and they have all these different species, and Drosophila make sounds when they court each other. So a male and a female will be on maybe a piece of fruit or something like this, and the male will be following the female and trying to chase her, and he'll stick out one wing, just one wing, and while walking, he'll wave it back and forth and make a sound that she can hear with her antennae, her heuristic. And so these things on the right are kind of examples of recordings from these couple dozen different species, kind of illustrating the variety of the sounds that they make. Generally, they kind of come in two classes. They make these pulsatile sounds like this, or they make these sinusoidal sounds, which kind of look like this. So this is called pulse song. The pulses generally come in trains, many one after another, and this is called sine song. But you can see as you, for different species, the pulses kind of look different, and the sine maybe has a different carrier frequency, and maybe some harmonics in there. Maybe for the pulses, there's a different interval of time in between each pair in the train. And some species don't sing pulse at all, but they have two different sine songs. There's a whole lot of variation. So the task that I was assigned was to write me a software program that can automatically take all these recordings and tell me where every single pulse is and where the sine song is. Now, we actually had a program to do this just for melanogaster. This is the most studied fruit fly in the lab, is melanogaster. We actually had a program from a few years back that worked very well on just melanogaster, and it used a signal processing heuristic technique where to find pulses, we used a time domain technique where we just fit a wavelet to the time series and found periods in time which matched kind of the expected shape of a pulse. And for sine song, what we did was we used this very fancy technique called multi-taper harmonic analysis, which is a frequency domain way using Fourier transforms to look for periodic signals that are of, not just a short, but kind of a long interval. And this worked reasonably well. We got, 80% accuracy or even 90% on good days. And it came with like maybe 20 different parameters, which you could kind of hand tune to fine tune it to the particular thing you were studying. And David spent a little time trying to tweak those parameters, getting it to work for all these other species and not just melanogaster. And he was complaining to me about it one day about how finicky it was. And I said, oh, David, in this day and age, this is like 2017 or 2018 by that point, when deep learning was, hugely popular and the de jure thing to use. I said, we should really just do a complete rewrite of this and use a supervised learning approach where you can just give the computer a few examples of what you're looking for. We can train up a neural network, and then you can make predictions and classifications on your recordings, and you don't have to hand tune all these really finicky parameters for exactly what the wavelet looks like and the multi-taper harmonic analysis and all that stuff. So I went looking around to see if there was any prior art that we could kind of build on top of. And as it happened, TensorFlow, which is one of the main machine learning frameworks. At that time, it was the main machine learning framework. These days, PyTorch is kind of taken over. But 3 years ago, when we started this project, it was TensorFlow. And in their GitHub repository, one of kind of the standard example workflows that they had, applications, was essentially speech recognition, human speech recognition, where they would use, train up a convolutional neural network to recognize any set of words you gave it. And the example data set they had just had yes, no, up, down, left, right, on, off, stop, and go, so 10 words. You just input a raw waveform. It would do, make a spectrogram essentially out of it. A Mel frequency substrum is just a kind of a modified spectrogram. You go through a convolutional network, and then output would become probability waveforms, one for each word, which would indicate when these words would happen. And so this is exactly what we're looking for. So we started with this, and we just kind of tweaked it and wrote a really nice GUI on top of it. And that's essentially what SongExplorer is. So a little more details. The only significant change we made to that TensorFlow speech recognition application was that instead of inputting into the convolutional neural network a spectrogram, instead we just used the raw waveform. We've got enough data to where that actually works really well. And just kind of a few details for any of you out there who understand or have some experience with machine learning. We use the Atom optimizer with the rectified linear unit as our nonlinearity. And then we actually downsample the waveform from its original sampling rate using strided convolutions and dropout. And so it's really not fancy at all in terms of the machine learning involved. This is about as boring and off the shelf as you can get. There's not even residual connections. The connections just immediately go from one layer to the next, to the next, to the next without skipping over any layers. So it's that plain and simple. It is not anything fancy at all. So the data sets that we have that we're working with and that I'm going to kind of show you the results for today are 25 recordings that are each 45 minutes long that David published in 2014. And they were taken in these very small chambers, about 1 centimeter in size, where you put in a male and a female, and it has a mesh bottom with a microphone underneath recording the sounds that they make. I should have had a picture for this, I'm sorry. A few years later, Kiriaku's lab densely annotated these recordings, and they found with 2 annotators, a consensus of 2 annotators, they found about 50,000 pulses across these 25 recordings. And so what I did then was I inserted in between, because I knew it was the dense annotation and they had nominally labeled every single last pulse that was in these recordings. I went ahead and added a second word. They did not annotate sign song because they were only interested in pulse. And so what I did was then I needed a second word. And so what I did was I made a not pulse word where in between every adjacent pair of pulses, I would stick in an interval and label that not pulse. All right. So those, we're going to talk today then about a two-word model, pulse and not pulse, and that's where this comes from. So we use this data then for training and validation, and then as part of a paper that we're working on, we made a new set of recordings, and we densely annotated just 1 minute of those recordings. It's a fair bit of work to annotate, particularly if you're doing it densely. These were slightly different chambers, though they were roughly the same size. They were round instead of rectangular. And instead of coming to a consensus, the 2 annotators, working together to decide what the right answer was when they disagreed on a particular annotation, we just kind of worked with these 2 annotations separately instead of trying to combine them like Kiriaku's lab did. So what I'm going to show you then is, so neural networks trained up using this data set, and then we're going to quantify the accuracy on this withheld test data set. That's kind of the kosher, proper way to do things with machine learning. If you really want to report the accuracy of a neural network that you have, you need to do so on data that the neural network has not been trained on. And that's why we have this entirely different test set. Okay, so here's an example waveform that we input to the network up here. You've already seen examples of this on the first slide, but kind of here's another one. We've got all these pulses here. This is the different time scale than on that first slide. So, but you can see how these pulses like to come in trains. Maybe it kind of looks like a woodpecker, I'm not sure. And then before here, we got this kind of quiescent period. Maybe there's a little bit of a sine song kind of right in here, very faint. This looks like it's really ambient. There's nothing going on here. You can kind of see a very much slower periodicity here. This might be some electronic noise. It could be 60 cycle. I'm not quite sure. But what I've done is I've labeled all of this on the left as not pulse, as well as all these intervals in between the pulses as not pulse. And then there's just a single point in time at the peak of each pulse that has a pulse label. Everything else is not pulse. When I stick this waveform into the neural network and I give it lots of examples, I can get outputs that look like this. So that very last layer of the neural network is again simply two neurons, which give output a value between 0 and 1. One of them indicates the probability of a pulse, and the other indicates the probability of not pulse. And you can see these gray lines here indicate exactly when the pulses occurs. We drop them down across the probability waveform, so you can see that the probability of a pulse exactly coincides with when the pulse occurs in the waveform, and not pulse is much wider at the peak and kind of spans most of that interval in between. Right, so qualitatively, this looks really good. And what we need to do is somehow draw a line here, a threshold, so that we can discretize, binarize these probability waveforms and make an ethogram, to where you can say, this is where a pulse occurred and nowhere else. In other words, get rid of this analog real value and just give me a Boolean. There's a pulse here or there's not. And to do that, we need a threshold. Because the idea here is we've got a little bit of a peak here. Do we want to call that a pulse or do we not, right? Where are we going to draw the line? So as I said, just as a reminder, please don't hesitate to stop with questions at any point. We've got another 3.5 hours, so tons of time, right? So don't let yourself get lost. If you're confused, stop me right away so that you can follow along with the rest of the talk, all right? So how do we draw that line? Okay, so what we did was we tried a whole bunch of different thresholds spanning from 0 to 1, and then looked at the validation data set, made predictions on the validation data set, and tried a whole bunch of different thresholds to see where we got the best congruence between the output of SongExplorer and our ground truth human annotations done by Kiriaku's lab, right? So if we set a really low threshold, that means SongExplorer here in green is going to call lots of things a pulse, right? If your threshold is really low, it's going to get those little tiny blips and it's going to call it a pulse. But no one else, Kiriaku, will not have labeled that as a pulse. And so we're going to have all these false positives, right? But if we raise the threshold, then those false positives go down to a much lower level, right? But then what starts to happen is that this orange line here, as that threshold becomes higher and higher and higher, you start to miss pulses because sometimes that probability waveform doesn't exceed it. And so what happens then is that there's pulse events which only Kiriaku labeled as a pulse, and SongExplorer missed it. So these then would be your false negatives. So what we do then here is then choose the threshold where that false positive rate and the false negative rate cross. And so we have an equal number of false positives and false negatives. And that's kind of what we've chosen to do here in these examples. Now, clearly, if you're using this for an experiment, like many of you who have data, right? Depending on your experimental design, these two types of errors, type 1 and type 2 errors, false negatives and false positives, one of them, they might not be equally bad in terms of how it might affect your conclusions, right? Sometimes it's really important that you don't miss anything, and it's okay if every once in a while you call something that's not there, right? In that case, then maybe you'd adjust your threshold to skew the errors in a favor in a way that's more suited to your experimental design. If you're more tolerant of false negatives, then you would use a lower threshold. If you were less tolerant, you use a higher threshold. But for here, kind of we're going to take the on average use case and say we're going to set the threshold where the false negatives and false positives are going to be roughly equal, and then set this, choose that threshold on the validation data, and then makes predictions in ethograms on that test withheld test set where we have 2 annotators and see how it does. And the vast majority of pulses everyone agrees on, and maybe only about 10% of them does only SongExplorer get. And that's roughly about the same amount as one of the annotators missed, but the other annotator got, and so did SongExplorer. So that's what this means. Kind of let me make sure everyone can understand this. Only SongExplorer means that SongExplorer called this as a pulse, but neither of the 2 human annotators did. Not SongExplorer means that SongExplorer didn't call it as a pulse, but both human annotators did. Not similarly, not person 2 means that person 1 and SongExplorer both called it as a pulse, but person 2 did not. Okay? Person 1 is either David or Yoon, and person 2 is Yoon or David. They didn't want me to tell you which is which. So you can see here then that the error that SongExplorer makes is roughly equal to the errors that the humans are making. And so we can't expect to do any better than that, right? That's kind of the gold standard. Since this is a supervised learning task, it can only learn to be as good as the ground truth. And here's the data that it's roughly as good as the ground truth. It can't get any better than this. But this is an easy task. It's only 2 words. It's pulse and not pulse. And it's not even paying attention to a type of song that we know is in these recordings, sign song, right? And this isn't even really the task that I was set to write a program to solve. That was to take 23 some odd different species or more even, each of which has 2, 3, 4 different words, and make a classifier to solve all of those. So how does it do when you expand the problem to this much larger size? And that's this data here. Okay, so what we did was we hired 2 high school interns for a summer, and then one of them stayed on and worked part-time on the weekends throughout the school year. And they made a whole bunch of annotations. We got, I think it was 9 or 10 different species. So this is Drosophila erectus. It has 2 different types of pulse songs and 2 different types of sign songs. This is Drosophila mauritiana. It has pulse and sign. This is Drosophila melanogaster. It has pulse and sign. This is Persimmilus, Pseudo-obscura, Santamea, Simulans, Tysserii, Willistonia, and Yacuba. So all in all, we have 43 words across however many species that was, maybe 9 or something. And they labeled, on average, maybe 1,000 different examples of each individual word type. We stick that into a classifier that has the exact same architecture. As this, except for instead of having 2 outputs in the bottom, it has 43. So you get 43 time series that go from 0 to 1 to indicate where the probabilities were. You play this same type of trick, picking out where you want to set your thresholds, and then you can get a confusion matrix that looks like this. Nominally, the only non-zero entries here should be along the diagonal, and the overall accuracy is about 91%. All right. So what this means is, if we annotate something as Mauritiana sign, then the vast majority of the time, whatever that flavor of green is, that would be in here somewhere. Maybe that's about 85%, right? Vast majority of the time, it's labeled, it's classified as Mauritiana sign, right? So everything should be along the diagonal. And these ones that are slightly not 0, that are off the diagonal, are the errors. So on occasion, Persimmilus sign 2 was classified as other, all right? Okay, does that make sense? All right, so now Yoon was very adamant that I include the next slide because she was very worried that you guys would walk away thinking, oh my gosh, they've collected 10,000 annotations in some species for some words. That's a lot of work. SongExplorer is unusable. I'm not willing to do that amount of work. Forget it. I'm gonna leave the tutorial now and go home. Okay, as it turns out, you don't need nearly that many. We asked our high school students to make that many annotations before we came to the appreciation that SongExplorer is actually really good at working with just a very few annotations. It doesn't need nearly that many. So what I did with that pulse, not pulse model I showed you from 2 and 3 slides ago, right? I took those 30,000 some odd annotations that we used to train that network up, and I trained another model with half that many, and another model with half that many, and another model with half again as many. And I kept going down looking for, well, how low can I go until the congruence, doesn't look great anymore. And it turns out you can go all the way down to about 50, maybe 100. This is 100, this is about 50, I think, right? So you don't need that many at all for this very simple 2-word model, pulse, not pulse. You can get by with just, 50. And that's, 50 annotations, as you'll see in the demo, is maybe a few minutes worth of work, something like this. Really no big deal, right? So, in the last tutorial session on Monday, someone had asked, well, how does that work with a 43-word model? And I don't have that data. You probably need more, right? And the other thing to keep in mind is that the number of annotations you need is probably dependent too on how much variability you have in your data. It could be the case that melanogaster pulses are very, very stereotyped with very little variability, and that's why we can get by with so few. So the point I'm trying to make is that how many annotations you need is going to be kind of dependent on your use case, how many words, and the variability in your data. But in our hands, we can get by with actually very little. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the supervised approach, kind of supervised part of the talk, and I'm kind of going to get into the unsupervised applications now. Be a good time for questions if anybody had any on what I've talked about so far. I'll take a sip of water here so we can have a second to think.
So I have a quick question. So the annotations would be based on pulse, not pulse, but then like, is it a group of pulses or is it like the intensity or like how big is the pulse?
The annotations are just for the pulse. The annotations we used for pulses were just a single point in time. The Yoon and David and Kiriakou just labeled a single point in time and said, this is a pulse. And then what I did to clean that up a little bit is I took a little window of the waveform around the pulse that they put down, and I picked out the peak within that window. And so I aligned their annotation to the peak of the pulse that was nearby, so that all the annotations then were aligned to that peak. But that's the only manipulation I made, was just the idea being that you can annotate things faster if you don't have to be as temporally precise. If you have to zoom in really close and very carefully annotate just the peak, then that really takes much longer than if you can kind of keep a zoomed out view and then just kind of a little bit haphazardly just kind of lay down pulses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess what I couldn't understand very well is that it's going to be a binary, like either like there's a pulse or there's no pulse, but why do you need all these annotations? This is my question.
All which annotations?
Like, because you were talking about like, for example, like you need more than 50 annotations. So what do you mean by that?
Well, Kiriakou laid down, I'm still not quite sure I understand the question, but maybe I'll try to take a stab at it. Kiriakou laid down 50,000 annotations, right? And the whole point of this graph is just to show that you don't need that many. We can get by with 50 and achieve roughly the same level of accuracy. Does that answer the question? Like I said, I'm not sure I quite understood it.
I guess it's just I couldn't understand what do you mean by annotation? I mean, what do you annotate exactly? Because if it's just annotating the pulse as like there's pulse or there's no pulse versus like the shape of the pulse, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no. You're not annotating the shape. You're simply okay. Saying it's the first thing you said. You're simply saying there's a pulse right here.
Yeah,
and there's not a pulse over here.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And then the network, it learns the shapes. That's the idea. You just tell it where it is, and it will learn the shape. Yeah. Okay, so part 2. So as I said, it is a little bit of work making annotations, and lots of people, you have to twist their arms to kind of get them to do that. Even if your use case, you don't need that many, even if 50 suffices, it is still a little work. And so there are some unsupervised things that you can do, and I'm going to describe 2 of them. The first actually is kind of a, it's kind of a hybrid between the 2. It starts out with a model that you've trained using supervised learning. In other words, you have a set of ground truth annotations and you've trained up a model, in this case, to recognize sine song, pulse song, ambient, and the interpulse interval. All right, so now we've got a model with 4 words. This is Drosophila melanogaster. And I don't remember how many annotations we have here. Oh, but this is the Kiriaka data set. So we have, on the order of 50,000 pulse annotations, and David and Yoon went ahead and added some sine song annotations. I think there's only maybe about 1,000 of those, so not nearly as many. I automatically created some interpulse interval annotations, since we know that the pulse annotations are dense. Kind of like I did with not pulse, I just stuck in ranged intervals that indicate where the interpulse intervals were. And then ambient, we kind of manually annotated as well. We just looked for periods in time where there was no signal at all, and created an ambient label. So we trained up then a 4-word model using supervised learning. And what we found is that we could get them, we could create these really nice clusterings if we looked at the activations of the hidden layers. So let me just walk you through this. So we have all these annotations, and we train up a model to predict where these 4 words occur in a waveform, right? Just like I've shown you in the last few slides, okay? Now, if we take the periods in time where pulse song is annotated, for example, and we run it through the network, we take those little snippets of the waveforms, and we do a forward pass through the network as if we're going to make a prediction of whether that's a pulse or not, right? Or a sine or an ambient or an IPI. Now, as you go through here, all these artificial neurons that are in each of these hidden layers will have a certain level of activation, right? And if we take those activations in that final hidden layer, right? This is just a bunch of numbers that can be used as a representation of what the sound is at that time. And then we cluster, we do that for all the different pulses and that we've labeled, all the different signs that we've labeled, all the different IPIs, all the different ambients. We take whatever set of numbers is here for each of those different types of words, and then we cluster it using UMAP or TSNE. Maybe even PCA would work, but this example here is using UMAP. Then we can really nicely, using the activations in that hidden layer, get a nice separation between our 4 different types of words. If we were to do that same type of clustering, but we were to do that on the raw waveforms, it looks like this. So if you just take snippets of raw waveform out for pulse, sine, ambient, and IPI, and now you have a vector of length 124 for 50,000 different pulses, and you cluster those raw waveforms, you don't get anything. But if you pass it through the network, a network that's been trained to tell the difference between pulse and sine and ambient and IPI, and you take these hidden layers and you cluster that instead of the raw waveform, you can learn to distinguish periods in time that belong to different words. All right. So this is still completely supervised, but then if you take this same network and you classify a recording that say you haven't annotated, or maybe you have, but you look at different points in time, things that haven't been annotated as being anything, right? Then you can examine new recordings maybe from the same species, maybe from a different species, maybe from one you've annotated, maybe from one you haven't. Maybe if it's the one you've annotated, it's at different times that you're looking at times that you haven't annotated. But you can pump then new sounds through this network, make a clustering of these hit state activations, and see where it lies in this space. And that's on this next slide here. So here is just repeating again that lower right figure from the last slide. And then here, I've taken sounds from a different recording from Drosophila and melanogaster that we haven't annotated. I've simply detected sounds using a simple threshold in time. So everywhere where there's a sound that exceeds the mean plus and minus, say, 2 standard deviations of the ambient background noise, I clip out that little section of time, I run it through our network, and I cluster it in this same space, and I get this, right? Now, lots of these guys fall in the same area here. So they're most likely pulses, right? These guys up here, they kind of overlap with where the interpulse intervals are up here. So they're probably IPIs, right? But there's 2 kind of densities here, really dense here, right? And there's a little bit of guys here, but it's fairly sparse there, not nearly as dense as say down here, right? And there's a big density over here as well, that not really present over here either, right? So here now we've taken a trained model that's been trained with supervised ground truth annotations, and we've looked at a new recording kind of in an unsupervised way, where all we've done is taken a simple threshold in time to find where their sounds are so that we don't waste our time on ambient sounds. And we've found things which don't really fit into these 4 categories. And as I'll show you in the tutorial, SongExplorer has a really nice way where you can just click on a point right here. It'll draw a little circle around there, and then it'll pull up 100 different waveforms that are in that area of the cluster space and show you what they look like. And this is not pulse, and it's not sine. It's a different type of sound that came from a melanogaster recording that our human annotators hadn't annotated and that we hadn't trained our neural network up on. Similarly, this guy over here looks like this. Now that kind of looks like a pulse, but they didn't label it as a pulse. It's something different. And I guess David is not here to correct me if I'm wrong about this. I don't see him there, but he has told me that this is actually a female making sounds. I think both these guys are actually females making sounds. These guys, pulse and sine, are both sounds that the males make, right? And these guys, if I understand correctly, are sounds that the females make when they're actually copulating. So these are pre-copulatory sounds that the male makes while they're recording, but before they actually copulate. And these are sounds, I believe, that the females make while they're actually copulating. And so we found that using a network that we had trained up for something else, and then just in a very easy, simple fashion, ran a new set of sounds through there, looking to see if there were any types of words that we missed. All right, so this is kind of an unsupervised application that you can use SongExplorer for, is to look for words that you might not know, or the literature, the human people might not know that species make. You train up, what we know, and then you kind of look for things we might not know about using a method like this. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so that's kind of the first unsupervised application I'm going to talk about, although this is kind of a hybrid approach, right? We can do one step better and make it completely unsupervised, where we have no ground truth annotations at all. Okay, now we have a little bit of advantage here in this set of data, in that they were collected in a lab, and we know that each recording has only a single species in it, because we've got these little tiny chambers, and we've put a known species in there with a microphone and recorded. So what we did here again is we just took a simple threshold in time, and anything which was louder than a certain threshold, we kind of snipped out of a recording, and we labeled it by the species that we know was in that recording. There's only one. It's not a field recording, it's a lab recording, so we kind of have a little bit of an advantage here. And we did that for all these species here, 23 species, I think, right? Or something like that, all in the Drosophila genus. And so we have, you know, on the order of 20-ish recordings, 10 maybe on average for each species. And we have maybe on the order of a couple thousand loud portions of time for each of those species. And then we just train up a network that does species detection. Tell me what species this is. So no human annotations at all. We just, in a completely automated approach, pull out loud sounds in a recording, label it with a species, and train a network to tell me what species that is. In a similar fashion then, we can cluster the hidden state activations of the neural network. We can see that the raw waveforms don't really segregate at all, but that final hidden layer right before the output, you can definitely see that there's non-identical distributions between the different species, right? And you might have noticed back here that I actually split our melanogaster data into two different words as a negative control, all right? And that's kind of what this guy is all about. Normally, like I said a few slides ago, all the non-zero entries should be along the diagonal. That would be a perfect score. But you can see here that these two here, melanogaster 1 and 2, are really highly confused with each other. And that's what we'd expect because of the same species, right? This is, again, as I said, our negative control to make sure that we're doing what we think we're doing, right? And so you can't really see the melanogaster. I didn't put a legend over here. I should have, I suppose. But in this next slide, I'm going to repeat that lower right figure. So this guy down here from hidden layer number 3, I'm going to repeat that here. This is melanogaster 1. This is melanogaster 2. You can see those distributions are nearly identical, right? They look very similar, but a different species, totally different distribution, right? So the idea here then is if you have the advantage that you have a recording and you can know what the species is, and then in an automated manner, you can train up a network like this, and you can look for differences between different species, right? So, for example, one of the experiments going on here at Genelia is taking crosses between two species and seeing if the sound is different. So in that case, you take both the parent species plus the hybrid species, train up a network like this. If in this clustering, they both had the same distribution, then you could say, well, they're not different, they're the same. But if the hybrid species came out looking like this, and the two parents looked like, it looked different than the parents, then you could say, there's some differences there. And then, as I said earlier, SongExplorer provides a really nice GUI where you can go just click on a point, and it'll show you what all the songs look like. And then you can easily go see how things are different. Another example is Josh Lilvis here in Barry Dixon's lab is making Drosophila melanogaster mutants where he's turning on and off certain neurons to see how it affects song, right? And so similarly then he can take all his lines, which have different neurons turned on or off, and he can kind of, because he knows which species he's recording from in that chamber, simply detect for loud sounds, train up a classifier, and then really easily test the null hypothesis of are there any effects on the courtship song using this, right? Does that all make sense? Okay, great. The last thing I want to kind of highlight is kind of an area we're exploring with SongExplorer to whether it can be used with real-time applications. So everything I've shown you before has been offline. You recorded the data yesterday or this morning or a year ago. You're not in the midst of recording it right now. I didn't describe it, but what we used was a context window that was about 200 milliseconds long, right? And then we fed that into our neural network, and it made a prediction as to whether there was a pulse right in the middle of that 200 millisecond long window, right? But if you want to be able to, say, turn on a light bulb as soon as that pulse arrives, you don't want to wait 100 milliseconds after the pulse comes before you make your decision, because 3 more pulses would have happened before then. So the first thing kind of we needed to do to test whether whether SongExplorer could be used to turn on a light bulb as soon as a pulse occurred was to take this 200 millisecond context window and shift it to earlier in time, to where most of it occurred before the pulse of interest and maybe just a little tiny fraction afterwards. And then train up a whole bunch of models like this and then test the concurrence. And as it turns out, it doesn't really have much of an effect. If we look at the duration of the context window after the annotation, we can essentially reduce it all the way down to just about 5 or 10 milliseconds and have no effect on the overall accuracy. Only if we reduce it all the way to 0, where we look at the 200 milliseconds before the pulse and nothing even after the peak of the pulse, do we get a little bit of false negative and a little bit of, let's see, this is only SongExplorer that'd be a false negative, right? So the false negative weight went up a little bit when we did that. But if we just left 5 milliseconds after the pulse, then everything was essentially the same. 5 milliseconds after and 195 before was the same as 100 milliseconds before and 100 milliseconds after. So I think this kind of shows us that it's at least possible that we could maybe make a prediction about 5 milliseconds after the pulse. The next question is the computer fast enough to do all that processing in time, right? And it turns out that if you don't make any changes to the code the way it currently works, then you can't quite get to real time. For like a minute of data, it takes you 1.07 or 1.2 minutes of data, 1.2 minutes to process that. So we're not quite real time, but that's doing things in a really dumb way. So think about the way this works. We take 200 milliseconds, which is 124 samples at 5 kilohertz sampling rate, and then we make a prediction right in the center. Then because we're doing 8x downsampling, we shift this whole window over by 8 samples, right? So we get 8 new ones on the end. We truncate 8 ones on the beginning. So the 1008 in the middle, right, are all the same. You redo all those calculations for that 1008 in the middle, stupidly, because you didn't have to predict the next point in time, right? So if you were to rewrite this, kind of make a very custom thing where you don't redo all those calculations in the middle, you just redo the ones for those next 8 samples and you keep all the remaining ones, the throughput might substantially get better. So we haven't done that yet, but I think there's so much redundancy in the code here, the calculations that it's making, that this is almost a no-brainer that it should work if we just kind of recode things to not recalculate anything that's already been calculated on the previous time step. What we don't have a grip at all on is latency. Just because it takes roughly a minute to process a minute of data doesn't mean that that minute of your answer comes back the same day, right? There could be a long latency, and that's something that I haven't had time to quantify yet at all. But I'm fairly confident. They have self-driving cars now that use convolutional neural networks, so it can't be that hard, right? I think we should be able to get a grip on this and make a real-time application. It's just a matter of whether David or somebody else wants to spend the time and money to make that happen. Okay, so that's all I have for the slides. You guys actually didn't ask me any questions to where I needed to pull up my extra slides here at the tail end. Is there any questions? I'm going to suggest that we take like a 5 or 10 minute break just to stretch our legs and maybe get a bite to eat or something like that. It's lunchtime here. Hit the bathroom if anybody needs, and then we'll kind of spend the rest of the time doing a demo. I mean, we're going to have 3.5 hours or more for a demo, but if there's any questions on the talk, now's a great time, and then we'll maybe take a 5 or 10 minute break.
Yeah, I had a question actually. Can you go back to the last slide real quick?
Yeah.
I think I might have missed, there it go. Yeah. So what exactly is like the lines underneath the auditory, the sound? Are
These
those
colored
like
lines
what?
here.
Yeah.
These are the context windows. So like I said, we have a 200 millisecond, we take 200 milliseconds of the waveform
Yeah.
to input into the neural network. And in the normal case, everything before this slide, the 200 milliseconds we took was this dark purple line at the top. So this dark purple line at the top, we took in those 200 milliseconds and we made a prediction where this vertical dotted line was. That was where the prediction was. But in a real-time application, then that prediction would have been made 100 milliseconds after that pulse happened, right? Because if your context window is 100 milliseconds before and 100 milliseconds after, then you have to wait 100 milliseconds after what you're interested in to make that prediction.
Yeah.
And so what we had to show then was whether SongExplorer, how its accuracy was affected if we took that entire 200 millisecond window and shifted it to the left, like in this yellow line at the bottom.
Right. Yeah. I think my question is actually really basic, actually. I guess I don't really understand what exactly is this context window. Is this sort of what the network is looking at this time to make the prediction?
That's right. So the neural network architecture is here.
Yeah.
It takes 1,024 samples in time
Mm-hmm.
as a time series and inputs it to a convolutional network and then outputs a probability 0 or 1. Did a pulse happen right here where this dotted line is? And if you take those 1,024 samples symmetric around
I got you.
where you want to make the call, right?
Yeah.
Or do you take the 1,024 all before
I see.
and end right at where the point in time where you want to make? Does that make sense?
Huh, got it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, great. So how about if we take a break then and we could meet back at, say, shall we say 1:20? My clock says 1:09. We'll meet at 1:20. That's an 11-minute break. My clock now says 1:10. So 10-minute break. Okay, perfect. I'll see you in 10 minutes. I'm back if anybody has any questions before we want to start up again.
I have a small quick question.
Sure.
Have you tried using an architecture like a variation autoencoder to do supervised dimensionality reduction of the data? Because
autoencoder.
A variational autoencoder.
No, we have not tried autoencoders of any sort.
Okay.
Yeah. But I understand there's other labs who've been playing around with that a little bit with birdsong, I believe. Yeah, that's an obvious thing to try, because then you wouldn't need any annotations at all, since you're just trying to recapitulate the input at the output. Yeah. You know, SongExplorer was designed initially with the supervised approach in mind. That's why. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also another thing, I haven't tried it yet, but I've seen that I think it was OpenAI, or it was PyTorch, I don't remember now, provides a tool that should be called Magenta. Forgive me for the lack of details, I don't remember. But it was a model that was trained, it was using a recurrent neural network and was using to do style transfer between different sounds, so a completely different final purpose, but the key was using a recurrent neural network. Have you tried, or do you have feedback about using them?
You know, the accuracies we're getting are good enough for us, and they're comparable to the human annotation. So we didn't really feel that we needed to go to any extra trouble to try all these other fancy approaches. Of course, you know, even these days, recurrent neural networks is a little bit kind of old school now, because transformers are the next big thing, right? When you want to try to incorporate really long context windows into your data. No, we haven't tried it, but however, we have, it's kind of on my to-do list, is to make a kind of a plugin architecture for SongExplorer to where people can put in their own models. As you'll see in this demo that's about to come, SongExplorer is kind of limited currently to convolutional neural networks. However, it does provide quite a bit of flexibility to specify the hyperparameters within the realm of a convolutional neural network. So you can say, how many layers do I want? How many feature maps do I want? What's my batch size, learning rate, and all the, you know, dropout or not? Do you want residual connections or not? All the normal hyperparameters that you would associate with a convolutional neural network, you can modify within the SongExplorer GUI. But that being said, as it currently stands, you can't get outside of convolutional neural network. And so one of the things I've been meaning to do is precisely for people who want to try recurrent neural networks or transformers or other you know, architectures, is to make a plugin system to where you know, you could write the code that backs up, you know, your architecture, and you could just give it to SongExplorer and say, use this for the architecture, not the convolutional neural network. So that is something I'd like to do, and I guess if, I'm not sure that, I don't want to say when that will happen, but that is something that we have talked about, yeah.
Thanks. I have one last question. So remaining within the context of convolutional neural networks, you say that you're using the raw signal instead of the transformed one, instead of using a spectrogram. In general, so in your particular case, yeah, again, you say that you're already reaching good accuracy, so it doesn't make sense to make the model more complex. But in general, do you think that passing to the frequency domain would increase the power of a model for complex tasks, or raw signal is enough?
So you'll see here in the demo that I actually am going to use a Mel frequency substrum as part of the demo. And I haven't, we haven't looked into this systematically, but I can tell you from just kind of informal use cases that it seems to me that networks train faster and require less data if you use a spectrogram. But like you said, that does make the model more complex. And so I think, just in terms of making things simple, if you have enough data and you're willing to wait a little while longer for the model to train, then I think using the raw waveform is a little more elegant. But the SongExplorer GUI does provide the option to use the raw waveform or a spectrogram or the Mel frequency substring, those three. And we're going to use the latter today in the demo just because we're in a hurry. We've only got 2.5 hours, right? But for all the lab use, the data analysis that we've done in the lab, we use the raw waveforms. Yep. That's another one of the things to try, and another things I'll try to emphasize in the tutorial. Hopefully, we'll have time to get to it. Is that the architecture I kind of showed you in the slides today? We actually spent a fair bit of time customizing to Drosophila melanogaster, and so for different species, rats or woodpeckers or dolphins or whatever. You're probably going to spend a little bit of time searching that space as well. Maybe 3 hidden layers is not quite right. Maybe 8 feature maps like we use is not quite right. Maybe a learning rate of 1e-6 like we use is not quite right for your data. But the SongExplorer provides kind of a nice way to kind of search that space and make it easy for you. So, okay. I think maybe most people are back. And I'll just go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen. Okay. Just let me switch cameras here. So I'm going to do everything on my laptop because I want to make the point that even though nominally, even with one-dimensional data, things are a little bit faster with GPUs, having a GPU is not nearly as critical with one-dimensional data as it is with 2, 3, and 4, and 5 dimensions. So I have a crappy 4-year-old Macintosh laptop that only has 2 cores, 16 gigs of RAM, and no GPUs. And that's what I'm going to use for the demo today, because as I said, I want to make the point that you can get started with SongExplorer without having some really fancy workstation with whiz-bang $2,000 GPUs in it, all right? Everybody's looking at this GitHub page, is that right? Did I choose the right screen? Okay, great. Yeah, so let me get back here. I believe I sent out the link, but if you haven't checked it out already, the SongExplorer source code is on GitHub, and I opened it to the public a week or 2 ago so that everybody could look at. It has a nice screenshot. If you haven't checked it out already, if you click on that YouTube screenshot, it takes you to a list of videos that essentially will recapitulate at least the first part of the demo that we're going to go through today. So if you don't want to go back and watch this actual recording, you can also watch these 2 YouTube videos, which I made a few weeks ago. I'm hoping to add more here. I was actually hoping to have more here already, but I kind of ran out of time getting prepared for making all the slides for the talk I just gave a few minutes ago. But there's this resource as well as this huge README. I've spent quite a bit of time writing up some text-based documentation about how all this works. And so what we're going to do today is just start from scratch. And we're going to start with installation on a Mac using Docker. And then we're just going to go to the tutorial and start going down here seeing how many of these things we can get and stop whenever we run out of time. At the session on Monday, we ran out of time at correcting false alarms. And I was really kind of bummed that we didn't at least get to correcting misses. I kind of told them I was hoping to get all the way to search hyperparameters, but we'll just see how it kind of goes today, all right? Okay, so installation on a Mac. I guess I should mention that if you got a Linux box, I would recommend Singularity there. You can use Docker, but I would recommend Singularity. But if you have a Windows or a Mac, then Docker is the way to go. I used to recommend Singularity on a Mac, but I just recently found a couple bugs in it. And so I think Docker is the way to go there as well. So the first thing to do there is to actually install Docker. And to do that, you just click on this link that I have in the documentation there. And it's going to take you to the Docker webpage, and you simply go to Products, and then Docker Desktop, and then you click Download. And that takes a few minutes, and so I didn't want to kind of do that online. I actually have it already installed and running. You can just see this cute little symbol of a whale with a bunch of containers on it. It looks like a container ship, but the ship is a whale. It's kind of cute. Okay, whatever. The next thing you need to do is download the SongExplorer image. You can click on this link and it'll take you to the Docker Hub page for SongExplorer, which is here, right? It has a little description and a link back to the GitHub page. I couldn't find a GUI way to download the Docker image. So instead, what you're going to need to do is just cut and paste on the command line. So you want to open up a terminal here. So on a Mac, you'd go Command space and search for terminal, and that would pull you up a little box, a window that looks like this. And from there, you can just cut and paste Docker pull BJ Arthur SongExplorer in, and it'll initiate a download of the Docker SongExplorer container. Now, that takes a little bit of time too. That may be 10 minutes or even longer if you're on a slow connection. So I've actually already done that too, but I just kind of wanted to walk you through how you did that during this tutorial so that it was very clear how to install. So yeah, this command finished instantaneously because it saw that I already had it. The next thing you need to do on a Mac is put these simple commands into your bash RC file, or if you're on the newest version of the operating system, it's called .zshrc, but I'm a couple versions behind because, like I said, I got a 4-year-old crappy laptop. Oh, there it goes again. I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with the command line, but I on the command line, the text editor that I like is called VI. And so we're going to open up in my home directory .bash rc like this. Like I said, if you were on a newer version, you go zshrc, but I've got an old, so it's bash rc. And then I've got a bunch of other junk in there, but you can see right here, I've got SongExplorer, which is this guy over here. You just need to cut and paste this guy in here. And then everything that's in square brackets in here is something that you need to kind of configure for how your particular computer is set up, okay? And I've kind of done that. And let me just kind of show you how those things are defined. I really want to get my lights back on. Don't like working in the dark. So that's how I have things set up there. You can see that the -v flag, what that does is, so the way containers work, I'm standing up here because I want to get the lights to turn back on. So a container is, for those of you that don't know, is just a file on the disk that contains an entire operating system, as well as all the applications that you need. And that way it's really portable. Anybody can download that container, and as long as they have Docker, they can run it no matter what their computer is, whether they're running which version of Macintosh OS X they're running, or whether they got a Windows, and whether they're running Windows 7 or Windows 10, or whether they got a Linux box, or whatever they're running. This Docker container contains the operating system that SongExplorer needs, which is Ubuntu, and it contains SongExplorer, and all the other junk that you need to make it run. And what this V flag here does here, this V flag, you have to, if you have a hard drive outside of the container on your computer that you want the application inside the container to see, you have to mount it inside the container. And so that's what that -v flag does. It says, I want to see /users as it's called on the outside, and I want to see it on the inside as called the same thing, /users. And the -v flag there, that's the -v. The -w flag simply tells the container where you want your home directory to be. And this light is refusing to come on. It's really starting to piss me off. Okay. The -w flag is simply what you want your home directory to be. So on a Mac, everything is in users / your username. And then I made a special directory for it today called SongExplorer. So the reason this is important is because SongExplorer has a GUI, of course, and it has a whole bunch of buttons and text boxes. And we're going to be putting stuff in all those text boxes. And to make it easy, when you restart SongExplorer the next day, it saves all that information in a file in your home directory. So that's also where the file dialog browser in SongExplorer starts up, is whatever you have the -w flag set to. That's your working directory. W is for working directory. So SongExplorer bin then is essentially just it's a variable which then takes you into the container, and any command you execute after that is executed inside the container like this. So we can say SongExplorer ls, and it'll give me a directory listing of what's inside the container. Okay, so we can kind of look in the SongExplorer directory that's inside the container, and we can see everything that's on the GitHub page. In particular, we can see that configuration file. So the first thing you need to do when you want to, not the first thing, because you've installed Docker, you've downloaded the Docker image, you've made these aliases. So the fourth thing you need to do is copy an example configuration file out of the container into the container to outside the container. So now we have this configuration file here. Let's go show you over here. Okay, so see inside SongExplorer, I now have this configuration file. All right, and this configuration file, I'm kind of skipping ahead a bit here. All right, yeah, here we go. SongExplorer copy configuration file out of there. This configuration file has a lot of different kind of settings that you can kind of customize SongExplorer to how you want to use it. In particular, all I really want to point out right here, the most important thing is your sampling rate. And for the exemplar data that I've included in the container that we're going to use in the demo today, and you can all try out at home because it's in the container, it's sampled at 2500 Hertz, it's Drosophila melanogaster, and it's one channel. But there's all sorts of other things that's in this configuration file that you might want to play with as well. These guys here have to do with whether you want to run the GUI like on one computer, but have all the compute done on another computer. That's really a common way that we use this here at Janelia. My department has a server full of GPUs, and if I give it the IP address of the server, I can have my crappy Mac laptop send jobs to that computer to run instead of running on my machine. We also have an on-premise cluster that I can configure SongExplorer to use instead, and that's what these three guys are about. SongExplorer, of course, has a GUI, and kind of configuring how that GUI looks is what this is all about. If you don't like the default colors that I've chosen, you can kind of go change them. One thing I'm not going to show you today is SongExplorer does have the ability to display a spectrogram of the song in addition to the time series. If you want to see that, then you need to set this variable to 1 instead of 0. But 0 just means it's off because melanogaster folks fly guys never look at spectrograms. This is actually a recently added feature. So I'd appreciate some feedback if you could try that out and you don't like it or it's broken. All these other guys have to do with the various different tasks that SongExplorer has. So you can detect sounds using simple thresholds. You can train a model. You can save the hidden state activations so that you can later cluster them. You can quantify the accuracy of a model. You can classify, you can make predictions on recordings. You can use a threshold to turn those probability waveforms into ethograms. And then you can, if you have dense annotations, you can calculate the congruence. So there's lots of variables in this configuration file which kind of specify how these tasks are done, or more specifically where, and whether you're going to do it on your own computer or somewhere else. And so I just kind of wanted to point that out. The most important thing to note as you first start getting into SongExplorer is that you need to tell it what the sampling rate is and how many channels that you have. All right. So that's that. And then I'm just going to keep kind of scrolling down through these docs and walk through this step by step. So here's the tutorial, and the first step in the tutorial, which is maybe the 6th step overall or something like that, is to pull some data out of that container. So like I said, the container has not only that configuration file in it, but it has a whole bunch of exemplar data that you can use to kind of play around with it when you first get started. And so we're going to make a directory here to put one of these WAV files in. We're going to copy a WAV file out, and we're going to start playing around with it. Okay, so if we go back and we look at our SongExplorer folder here now, we not only have this configuration file, but we've got a ground truth folder that has a subfolder that has a waveform, a WAV file in it. And this is, I think it's just 1 minute of Melanogaster song, something like this. Okay, so now we need to start SongExplorer. And so there, all we do is we just type in that alias that we made earlier to SongExplorer. And then we cross our fingers that we don't have a Steve Jobs moment and something screws up. All right. So it's going to spit out a bunch of stuff. In the first line, SongExplorer just does a quick query of your computer to figure out how powerful it is, how many CPU cores it has, how many GPU cards it has, and how much RAM it has. It also then spits out a website address that you just need to cut and paste into your web browser. I would recommend Chrome because that's mostly what I use, but it should work on Firefox as well, and it mostly works on Safari. There's one bug on Safari that I found, but you might not run into that. Yeah, so I know for a fact actually that this URL is not going to work, but this one does. So there's 2 URLs specified here. One of them will work on your computer for sure. This other one, for some reason works on mine and not the first. I'm not sure why. So all you do is cut and paste that into a browser, and then you'll see some more stuff get spit out here if everything is working correctly. It takes a little while the first time. It's got to compile some code. But it's not broken yet. You just have to wait. It is taking its time. It's usually a little faster than this. There we go. Whew. Had me worried there for a second. Okay, so now we got it working. That was easy, right? I told you in the email when I first sent out to you guys that installation is the hardest part. Well, we just did that in, I don't know, what was that, 10 minutes maybe? Okay, all right, no big deal. The GUI is kind of wide on a little narrow screen like this, so you can pan around a bit and kind of see all there is to it. On the very right is that same documentation that's on the GitHub page if you need to refer to it. The main area is kind of over here. This is where those clusters are going to are going to appear that I showed in my talk, right? Where we had those 4 discrete groups of different song, and then the 10 by 10 grid of little snippets of waveforms. That's here and here respectively, and then down here is kind of the whole waveform that you can look in the context. Over here is a whole slew of buttons that kind of give you a mean to kind of make things happen. This very top row of buttons I like to call the wizards, because they kind of set things up to guide you through certain workflows. And this is what we're going to kind of walk through from left to right. First, we're going to label some sounds, and then we're going to make some predictions, and then we're going to fix some false positives, fix some false negatives, and then hopefully if we have time, we're going to test to see how well it generalizes and maybe tune all the hyperparameters. And I almost for sure we won't have time to test densely, but if we get lucky, we will. These wizards, the green buttons on the very top row, what they do is they turn on, they turn off, I should say rather, the buttons in the second row, which you don't need to perform this workflow. So these guys down here I like to call actions. So you can detect sounds, you can train a model, you can save the hidden state activations, you can cluster those hidden state activations, and then you can visualize that cluster. That's what you need to do to label sounds. When you make predictions, you need to train a model, quantify its accuracy, freeze that model so that you can then classify a new recording and then make an ethogram of it. You notice all these other guys are all grayed out because to make predictions, you don't need to do any of those other things. To fix false positives, a different set of action buttons is turned off, appropriate to this task of fixing false positives. So the GUI seems a little complicated maybe because all the buttons are up there staring at you in your face. They're not hidden behind any menus or anything. But I think that turning off the ones that you don't need for the various different workflows should make things fairly intuitive. And then in the action buttons, you typically proceed from left to right, right? So from label sounds, first you have to detect, then you train, activate, and cluster. It goes left to right on that second row. And then similarly, all this stuff down here, the stuff you don't need when you do a detect, for example, is all turned off. You only have to fill in the stuff that remains. That's kind of your reminder. So SongExplorer should kind of walk you through what you need to do if you just kind of let it help you by choosing the wizard and then the action that you're trying to do. It should kind of tell you what it needs to know. All right. So the workflow here, to kind of get started, we're going to do the supervised bit first, where we're going to label some sounds that we're interested in, train up a model, and then make predictions on a new recording and see how well it does. So to make those initial annotations, we kind of do it in the same way we make all subsequent annotations, and that's we look at the clustered hidden state activations. And to do that, we first need to cluster some hidden state activations, and to do that, we need to have some sounds. But if we don't have any annotations, what we do is we simply use a simple threshold in both time and frequency space to find sounds, all right? And that's what this detect button does, is it simply uses a time and a frequency threshold to find things that exceed a certain amplitude. And then we're gonna pump those through an uninitialized network, all right? So it's telling us that we need a WAV file. And so what we do is we scroll down here to this file browser, and you can see it started up where I had the -W flag set to in our alias, right? And in there is that configuration file that we copied out of there, the ground truth data, and now there's this third file you'll notice, and this state file is what stores the values that I've put in for all these buttons, so that if I quit SongExplorer, start back up, it'll come back up like I left it, all right? But the detect button is asking for a WAV file. We copied it into this ground truth folder, so we just dial down into there, we click on it, and we click Wave Files, it puts it into here. You might have noticed now, if you were quick, that this Do It button just turned red. All right, it is now armed, and we can click it, and we will go detect sounds in this. Before that, let me just kind of clear that out. Notice that that Do It button was grayed out because something that the detect button needed was not filled in. All right, so it won't let you try to do something unless, not only does it gray out the boxes it doesn't need, but it won't actually let you do it until you fill in all the boxes that it does need. All right, because that button, the red Do It button, is gray. Okay, so we fill this back in with a WAV file. The Do It button goes red, it's armed. We can click it, it turns orange while it's kind of launching the process and goes back to gray. In the status bar here, we now see that we've got a detect job running on this WAV file. All right, it was initially gray while it was kind of spooling up that job, and then it turned black. Once it's done, it's going to either turn blue if it was successful or red if there was an error. So we can go back to our directory here in the Finder. We can see that there's a detect log file now that has the same prefix as the WAV file that we're running detect on. And yep, now that it's done, you see that the status bar turned blue over here, which means that there's no errors. But I want to show you what's in this. Now we have a third file here called detected.csv. And this is just going to be a comma-separated folder with one row for each sound that it found, right? The first column, I just want to kind of walk through this format because we're going to see lots of these CSV files. And they're all going to have a very similar format, and it's good for you to know how things look on the inside. So the first column in the CSV file is just the corresponding WAV file. Each row, rather, is a sound, and the first column is the WAV file that the sound was found in. Then the second and third columns are the start times, start and stop times, and ticks, sample ticks that this sound was found in. The fourth column is the type of sound it was. So in this case, it was a detected sound, as opposed to something that we annotated or something that the SongExplorer predicted or SongExplorer missed. There's several different values that can go in this fourth column. And then in the case of detected, we indicate whether it passed the time threshold or whether it passed the frequency threshold, and I'll describe both these in a minute, or whether it passed neither. So the neither is currently labeled ambient, and I think that's probably not a good choice of words because this is putative ambient because it passed neither the time nor the frequency threshold. I think in the next version of SongExplorer, I'm going to change this to say neither. I think that's a little bit more explicit and less presumptive. Okay, so what does it mean for something to pass the time and the frequency thresholds? That's what is in these boxes down here. Notice, with the detect button has grayed out all these other guys, but it wants you to fill in these 6 down here. All right. So in time, the way this works is that there's 2 values for sigma, the standard deviation. So what it does, it calculates the mean of the time series, and then everything that exceeds, in this case, the mean plus 6 standard deviations is considered to pass the time threshold. Any transient which goes above that, it's going to mark and say, it pulled it out here. It's also going to smooth things. So if it only passed that mean plus 6 standard deviations for like 1 sample tick, you're probably not interested in it. It's just noise. And so what it does is it smooths over, in this case, 6.4 milliseconds to kind of get rid of little outliers like that. And that's configurable. You can put in any value you want here. In terms of the frequency threshold, this is a little more complicated because it uses multi-taper harmonic analysis, which is a fancy way of doing Fourier transform. But it takes a number of parameters. The 2 which are kind of most easy to explain are that in the end, it gives you a p-value, and the threshold is defined on that. So in this case, if it's more significant than 0.1, and it lasts for longer than 25.6 milliseconds, then we consider that to have passed the frequency threshold in this case. For it to pass neither, we actually have a second set of values. So if it's below the mean plus, in this case, 3 standard deviations in the time series, and it's less significant than a p-value of 1, okay, then we consider it to be putative ambient, which in the future will be called neither in those CSV files, all right? So that's how this works. So what we then have, just to kind of reiterate, is we have all these things which are sounds and that we probably want to assign some labels to. And the way we're going to do that is we want to cluster it.
Question, real quick.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Is the frequency threshold, is that an upper threshold or lower threshold? And can you configure that?
Well, the first one is a lower threshold. It has to exceed a p-value more significant than 0.1, and the other one is an upper threshold. It has to be less significant than that. Does that make sense?
So it's not just looking for like this sound is a certain like this frequency. So the reason I'm asking is because pub calls are normally at like 70 kilohertz frequency. So can I threshold?
This is looking across the entire frequency band all the way up to Nyquist.
I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't try to delimit a band of frequencies that it's looking at. It looks from DC all the way to half your sampling frequency.
I see.
Looks for everything.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Is that important to you? Is that would it make things easier if you could specify I'm only interested in things in this range?
The only reason is because it helps get rid of noise a lot of times. Just
Okay.
because I don't need, because I'm not interested in anything lower, so I could just get rid of all the noise.
Oh, I see. You sample at a really fast rate because you need to go to high frequencies, but then all the low frequency stuff you don't care about.
Yeah.
Well, that's something that would nominally be fairly straightforward. We could add another button here, right? Another text field to add something like that if that was a huge pain on your part.
I think it might be okay either way. I think that there's normally not too much noise, so I don't think it should be too impactful. I was just,
okay. Yeah, but that's the type of thing that would be fairly straightforward. How many people, if everybody found that useful, then obviously a no-brainer, we should do that. But currently as it stands, no, we don't do that. But yeah, good question. Right, okay, so we want to take these sounds that are loud, either in time or frequency, right? And we want to cluster them so we can kind of use the same type of interface as we'll do when we fix false positives and false negatives. So what we need is a model to kind of pump through, but it doesn't need to be trained because we're just going to cluster in the input space because we don't have any human ground truth annotations yet. So we're going to just initialize a model. And now when I click on this blue train action, this logs folder is up and asking me that it needs to be filled in. I know that because the do it button is grayed out and I can't proceed without giving it a folder to put my model in. So I'm just going to call this untrained classifier right here. It also wants to know where the ground truth is. This is not per se ground truth yet, since we don't have any annotations, but it wants the folder where that detected.csv file is. So we put that in there. Notice now that the red do it button is now red. This test files button, it's not grayed out, but it's not filled in. The fact that the do it button is now red means that this is optional. So remember earlier during my talk when I said the proper way to kind of quantify your accuracy with machine learning is to withhold a portion of your data to not train on and save that to test on the accuracy. This is where you do that. If you had a set of files that you wanted to not train on, you'd put that in here. But that's optional. All right, so the do it button is red, and importantly also here, notice that these guys also are now not grayed out. The wanted words, so in other words, we want the rows in that CSV file that have time, frequency, or ambient in that 5th column. And we want the rows that have detected in the 4th column, right? That's what this guy's saying, the wanted words and the label types, right? And label sounds button automatically fills these in for you. So you shouldn't have to do that. That's why they're already here. Notice that if I switch to make predictions, this changes, all right? Because you want a different set of defaults here. All right, so starting out, this should be automatically filled in. You shouldn't need to worry about that. All these other guys here, remember how I said that SongExplorer is kind of limited to a convolutional network, but it provides all the flexibility to completely define how you could change that neural network, that convolutional neural network in every possible way. Well, that's kind of what all these buttons are all about. And I don't want to get into that now. If we have time, we'll get into it later. The defaults are good for the data in the tutorial that we're going to walk through now. So I'm not going to make any changes there. I'm going to leave number of steps here to 0 because, like I said, we don't need a trained model. We just want it to be initialized because we're just kind of dumbly going through through the network kind of in the same way we're going to go through things later. Okay, so everything's kind of set how it is. We hit the do it button. Notice now the status bar, the old job, the detect, which finished successfully, it gets deleted from the status bar. A new entry that we're training, it's going into the unclassified directory, right? Untrained classifier folder that we just specified. We can go back here now. It's right here. A whole bunch of stuff is created in here. And I'm going to kind of, we don't actually need to look at this yet. As soon as we have a trained model, that's more interesting. But maybe for the time being, I'll kind of show you inside train_1.log. This first bit here is just recapitulates everything that was over here and all these buttons. It gets repeated in the log file so you can have a record of exactly what you did. Down here, you can see the network architecture. So we have convolutional layer 0. It has a shape like this. Convolutional layer 1 has its shape. And then we have a final layer. So in this particular case, we only have 2 hidden layers, whereas all the stuff I showed you in my talk, we had 3, slightly different because our sampling rate's different. All right, and then also in this log file, it shows you what annotations we're training on. Right, so we got 1,000 ambient, 45 frequency, and 500 time. All right, that's really the only thing we need to take away from there now. Actually, that information is actually already over here too, down in the lower left of SongExplorer in this table right here. When we did the detect action, when it was done, it updated this little table here, just so you can see what's in your ground truth directory. All right. Okay, so train finished successfully. Now proceeding again, as I said, left to right in the actions, we go to activations, and it wants a checkpoint file. And maybe I should have shown you that back here. In your model directory, your logs folder, your model directory here, right? In addition to that log file we were just looking at a moment ago, there's a train_1 directory. And inside there, you'll find these checkpoint files. They always come in 3s. For each checkpoint, you have 3 files, and this just stores essentially all the model weights. So all the projections from one layer to the next have a weight associated with them. They're kind of analogous to synaptic weights in a natural neural network, right, in the brain. And so those weights are all kind of stored in these files. And that's what this guy is looking for here. It's looking for one of those checkpoint files. So we're going to go back over to that untrained classifier inside train_1R. And just, you can pick any of the 3, it doesn't matter. All it's looking for is CKPT-0. It's just looking for a file name with that in it at this point. Okay. So we filled everything in, and the do it button has correspondingly turned red. And now we can just do it. And again, as I said, all we're doing here is we're initializing a model randomly and we're saving it. Not doing anything else. I had to do a little bit of a rigmarole there. There was lots of stuff that maybe seems superfluous to you, but you'll get it when we go to fix false positives, because then it'll start making sense, because then we'll actually have a real model that we've trained. Okay, so again, the status bar is updated with the fact that we're doing activations. And if we go back to our ground truth folder, you'll see that in addition to having now the subfolder with a WAV file and our detected.csv file, we now also have these 3 activation files. And the data from all this is stored in this NPZ file. So if things went well, this should be relatively large, a large file, a few megs at least, right? This is turned blue, meaning that there's no errors reported in either of these log files. And then we can proceed to cluster. Cluster, all it needs is the ground truth directory. And it's the same one that we've been working with all along, so that doesn't need changed. We've got a few little choices here for what algorithm we're going to use to cluster. PCA, TSNE. TSNE is now a little old school. The new kid on the block is called UMAP. You can do either 2 or 3-dimensional versions of both. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to use 2 dimensions. You only really need to go to 3D if you have like more than, say, 10 words that you're interested in. If it's less than 10 words, you'll usually see discrete clusters in 2D, and 3D is too fancy. Like I already said, just to repeat, we only really need to look at the input layer cluster on this guy. So we click all that, and then we do it. Oh, and let me, actually, there was one thing I neglected to point out a minute ago, so maybe we're going to go back and do this over with. The activations, as I showed you over here, we have 1,700 total activations, but one of the categories only has 45 examples in it. And later on, when you're clustering, right now it's not important, but other times when you cluster things, it's important to have roughly equal numbers of examples of each category. And so there's a mechanism then to specify an equalized ratio. And in this case, so if you have 10 here, what that means is that it'll choose all 45 of the frequency, but max out at 450 of each of the other 2. Because this is the mechanism by which you kind of limit how disparate the group sizes are, all right? So it's actually not so bad that I accidentally forgot to change this and it's at 10, because in this particular case, it doesn't really matter. We don't care about this. So yeah, we're gonna keep up with the clustering. Yeah, right. I'll explain more on this later on. But the point is that when you do activations, there's a means here to kind of balance how big the set sizes are. And there's also, sometimes you'll have way more data than your computer can handle when it's doing the clustering. So even on my big workstation, I never put more than 30,000 here for max samples. And sometimes you'll have more than that. So it's important then to have a way to kind of subsample your data. And that's what this box does here. All right, so the clustering is done. And the next step is to visualize. And visualize, all it needs is the ground truth directory, because what it's looking for is this cluster.mpz file, which is automatically just put right next to the activations file in the ground truth directory, or whatever folder you have right here. All right, so visualize and then do it. And this time this stays orange a little bit because it's thinking. And once it goes back to gray, we can come back over to this left side. Sorry if I did that too quick. I know sometimes there's a lag on Skype. Now we see this cluster, all right? Now, this is clustering on the input. So remember from my talk, clustering on the raw waveforms doesn't typically look very good. These guys are all kind of mixed up. But you do see some blue up here and more purple down here, and maybe this is where the orange is right here. You can see that a little better if you just choose ambient from here, which, like I said, will be called neither at some point. And those are all the blue guys. We can change the dot alpha if that's a little dim, make it a little darker or a little lighter. And then the dot size, you can control it here, make them bigger or smaller. All right. Frequency is kind of clumped over here in orange, and time, things which pass the time threshold, I guess they have multiple different groups, right? So now the point is you just click in here, right? And as I described in my talk, SongExplorer will draw a fuchsia circle around that, and everything inside that fuchsia circle gets displayed over here, all right? Just a short little snippet in time around the window where that detected event was found. Then you can click on these guys, one of these guys, I'll scroll up here. See, currently this is blank down here, but if I click on one of these guys, then a broader window appears down here. So you can kind of see it in context, all right? And if we go back to the configuration file, the durations of these snippets, and as well as the duration of that context window, is specified in there. And let me just kind of pull that up for you guys, because the timescales of the things that you guys are going to be interested in are probably completely different than FlySong, unless there's just a random coincidence in the animal kingdom. So if you look at configuration.pysh, in there is GUI snippets in milliseconds, right? That's set to 40. 40 milliseconds is the width of what's being displayed right here, okay? And so that's just a thing you can go change. If your vocalizations happen to be a second long and you want to see the whole thing in there, then you would just change this accordingly, right? And GUI context width 400 milliseconds, right? That's the default here, 400 milliseconds. But now that is actually easy to change in the GUI. If you want to zoom out, you can click this button here. You zoom in, you can go here. If you want to pan to the right, pan to the left. Okay, if you want to go back to where you started from, you click the 0 in the middle. All right, so at this point now, we want to start making annotations. If you, I hope this font is not too small. This is why I did this on my small laptop monitor instead of my big desktop monitor. Can you read here that it says detected ambient? Okay, and over here it says detected time. Okay, you guys can read that just fine. Okay, so the idea here is that these gray boxes on the top half of this waveform is where the detect button found things. All right. Detected ambient is where it passed neither the time nor the frequency threshold. Detected time is where it passed the time threshold. And now we want to make some annotations. So we first need to put in the label that we're going to give these annotations. And so we're going to have three words here. We're going to go pulse, sine, and ambient. You just type those in these fields over here. And once you get the names in there, then there's a couple different ways to actually demarcate points in time. First, you can simply double click in the gray box on the top, and it'll automatically kind of fold that down to the bottom and label it pulse, whatever you have chosen over here in blue, right? And it'll use the exact interval that was detected, right? Maybe like in this example, that interval that's been detected doesn't really encompass exactly where you want it to. So instead, you can, in the bottom half now, instead of double clicking in the top, like I did over here, in the bottom, you can click and drag, and you can make, something of any width that you want arbitrarily. All right, so if we just then click and drag and then let go, a pulse interval is put down there. A third way to do it, maybe you don't want an interval, maybe you want a single point in time. In that case, you just double click on the bottom, and the single point in time would be labeled as pulse. A fourth way to do it, or are we up to 5 now? I forget. You click up here. Maybe you don't even need to see that context window down below to know that you like what you see up here in this snippet window. Or maybe just the default window down here is enough for you to see it, and you don't want to actually move your mouse. So if you click on something up here and you like what you see, you can just double click there and notice that it drops it down automatically to exactly the range that was detected. You can go over here, if you like what you see, you can just double click Double click. You don't have to mouse all the way down. You can stay up here, right? Okay, so there's many different ways to lay down an annotation. If you make a mistake, simple, you just undo it. And you see that guy disappears that we just laid down. If you realize undoing was a mistake and you want to put it back, you can just click on redo and it comes back. All right. So from here then, we just need to lay down a bunch of different things. All right. So these guys are clearly pulse 2. And I'm going to do this in real time. I'm going to lay down 100 annotations while we sit here, you watching me. You can think of a question while I do this. It's only going to take a couple minutes because I want to demonstrate just how fast and easy this is. We're going to take those 100 annotations and then we're going to train up a network. On this 4-year-old crappy old network, we're going to do 200 steps and it's only going to take maybe a minute or 2 to train, all in real time as we sit here and watch. I'm trying to demonstrate that this is really easy, okay? And it's lickety split, all right? So I'm going to kind of maybe stop talking here for a while, and if anybody has any questions, please feel free to just kind of chime in and ping me, and I'll try to multitask. And oh, but see, maybe that now wasn't quite right because we don't want to cover it to cover that pulse. You know, just like it's whichever one is in blue over here is what this can be labeled as, right?
Hey Ben, I had a question.
Shoot.
How does SongExplorer handle really variable ambient noise? Like a lot of my recordings were made in the field. There's cars going by. There's other songs that other birds are singing. Sometimes I'm talking. Is it able to recognize just anything that doesn't look like what you've specified it should look at as ambient noise? Or is it looking for similar signatures of ambient noise?
Ambient should be, there's a couple of different ways to handle field recordings with lots of noise like that. I mean, the question is it really just kind of background earth tone, or do you want to go create a class that says car, me talking, airplane, whatever, right? There's a couple different ways to handle that. In the lab, we have, of course, a lot less problems with that. But certainly, we do have, our soundproof room is not perfect, right? In fact, it's not a soundproof room, it's just a room. There's kind of 2 ways you could handle that. One is you could create a class which is truly ambient, where there's literally nothing else in the background. There's nothing else, no other animals, including you, vocalizing, no cars, no airplanes, no nothing, and call that true ambient. And then you could create an other class where you grouped in everything, right? You talking, cars, planes, everything else. Or you could break those down in different categories. Planes, one for planes, one for cars, one for you talking. The point is, I'm not sure whether it's better to have one class that's catch-all or to break it up. I'm not really sure. That might be something that you just kind of need to try.
Sure, yeah, I don't need to classify the ambient noise into different groups. I was just sort of verifying that even if you don't just have sort of like a flat level like in yours, it can distinguish ambient from your actual sound of interest.
It can, to the extent that you train it and have enough data, right? If you give it enough examples of this is not what I'm looking for, then it should be able to have an output tap that says, nope, the probability goes high in those circumstances. It's really just a matter of training it with enough examples that of things that you don't care about. And how many examples you need really kind of depends on how much variability is in your data set. If things are highly variable, then you're going to need a lot more data than if things are very very uniform. So I suspect that maybe with field recordings, you would have to have more data because maybe there's more junk going on in the background. And like I said, I don't really have a feel for that because all of the data that I deal with on a daily basis is in a recording studio, and we don't have that really. You know, actually, I have been in communication with Rafael Marquez, if I'm remembering his name correctly, who's at the Museum of Natural Sounds in Madrid. And I got some field recordings from him, and we did play around a little bit, but not enough for me to really answer your question well. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is I don't have a good answer. You're just gonna have to try it out.
Okay, yeah, I think that was helpful that you did answer my question. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else have a question? My computer actually is being a little bit laggy today. I don't know why. It's normally
I
the
had
GUI is
another
a little bit more
question,
responsive.
if I'm not
Oh, go
talking
ahead.
to someone
Yeah.
else.
No. Go ahead, yeah.
I'm curious if there's a way to handle pseudo replication. So if I have several bouts of drumming from one particular individual bird, do I just have to choose one bout from that bird, or is there a way for SongExplorer to recognize, you know, subgroups? Like if I'm looking at like a species cluster, but then I'm also looking at, you know, what the variation within an individual could be. Is that possible?
So are you asking whether you should annotate all the different recordings from an individual, or?
Yeah, if I have one individual, and they're really variable. So if I have one individual with 2 drumming bouts and one individual with 40 drumming bouts, should I standardize the number of bouts, or can SongExplorer group different I guess detections?
So what do you want SongExplorer to do? What's the task? You're gonna label bouts from multiple different individuals, and then you want it to go search field recordings for bouts of other individuals? Is that the task that you're looking to?
Yeah, and to see if different species, just like ultimately to compare different species and say, do these species drum differently? Are the drumming patterns different?
Right.
So if there's
okay.
different.
Well, the second thing you just described is the unsupervised approach, where
Okay.
you could. Well, I guess if you have lots of ambient noise in your recordings, you're going to have to isolate out the individual drumming bouts from the cars and whatnot. So it kind of sounds like you're going to need to have a supervised model first, where you first go isolate all the drumming bouts from the background noise. And then you would want to use that to make predictions on new recordings to pull out just the bouts from the noise. And once you have those, then you would want to do this supervised approach where you just take those and you cluster them to see whether SongExplorer can reject the null hypothesis that they're the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we'll get 60, 70, 80, 89. Okay, we'll just do a few more here.
Ben, I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I see that video button there. Are you able to load videos in to try to match them to the,
Yes, we
the
can.
audio events?
I don't have any videos here to do a demo of that. But if you have a MP, I forget the formats that are supported, but not all video formats are supported, but if you have it in the right format and it has the same prefix as the .wav file, then you can hit the video button, and right down here, you can kind of look at a snippet of the video, and then you can hit the play button, and everything that's in this context window, you will play through your speakers, and you'll be able to see it in the video as well. In fact, you don't even need to have the video for the play button to work. You can just, of course, I haven't tried this in a while and it doesn't seem to be working. Oh, please don't crash. Nominally, if you don't have video, you should be able to listen to the sound as well by clicking on this play button.
Awesome, that's very cool.
There might be a bug in it right now because it's not a feature that I use a whole lot, but there are people in David Stern's lab who do. So if that's not working, I need to fix it. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Oh, where did I move? Okay, I think maybe this is good enough for pedagogical purposes. Maybe we'll just do one more sine song. Okay. Okay, so now we've just in a matter of a few minutes, right? I wasn't keeping track, but it wasn't that long, right? We've cobbled together some annotations, and if we go back into our ground truth directory and look in the folder where that WAV file was, we can now see, in addition to the detected.csv file, we now have an annotated.csv file where this string of numbers in here is just a timestamp, right? It's the year, the month, the day, hour, minute, second, all right? If we look in there, like I said, it's got a very similar format to the detected.csv file. It's simply the WAV file that this annotation came from, the start time and ticks, the stop time and ticks, the fact that this is an annotated event to distinguish it from detected events like earlier, and then what I labeled it as, ambient, pulse, or sine. All right, and that is not indicated down here yet, but it will be as soon as we go on to the next step. We're going to move on to the next wizard, make predictions. Now that we have annotations, we want to train up a model so that we can make predictions on a new recording, a different recording. So this time, we're going to actually train it for real instead of just randomly initialize it and take no steps in training. So we're going to call it a trained classifier, and we might do this a couple times. So I'll call this trained classifier number 1. Notice that make predictions automatically filled in for wanted words here, whatever I have in the boxes over here, because these are the words that we're interested in. So it kind of took a few steps out of typing from you and put those in. It also changed the label types from detected to annotated automatically, but it's just switching from label sounds to make predictions. All right. It hasn't changed anything down here, left it all the same, but we actually do want to train for a little bit. We'll do for 200 steps. We'll check our accuracy every 10 steps. And since we don't have a whole lot of data, we need to withhold a fairly large fraction to test the accuracy on, so about 40%. All this else, everything else here stays the same. We click on do it, and status bar turns black. It's training. If we go back here, we can see now we have trained classifier 1 at the top level, and we have some more log files. So you've seen this log file before, but just to repeat, at the top, of course, is just all those parameters that are in the text boxes. Some of them have different names than the text box because I didn't like the default names that TensorFlow used. So it's a little bit difficult to match them up, but shouldn't be too hard. Again, down here is the architecture, 2 convolutional layers, and then a dense layer at the end. Here's our train, validate, split. We're going to train on 55 pulses and test on 29, train on 8 sines and test on 4. Okay. And once this guy gets running, then we can see step number 1 here, step number 2, step number 3, step number 10. It shows the accuracy on that batch of training examples, and then it computes a confusion matrix on the portion that are withheld to validate on. The validate here is this 40%, okay? And so you can see in the beginning, confusion matrix, right? It tells you what the row is. It's pulse, sine, ambient, other. Of the 29 pulses, they're all actually categorized as ambient. And of the 4 sines, they're all classified as ambient. And of the 5 ambients, they're classified as ambient. So everything is classified as ambient after 10 steps of training, right? But nominally that should get better, right? You can see after, how many steps is this now? After 40 steps, it's starting to look better. Nominally, the only non-zero entries in the confusion matrix should be along the diagonal. And now of those 29 pulses, 17 are being categorized as pulse, 2 is sine, 10 is ambient. So, okay, that's better than everything ambient, right? It's getting all 4 sines correctly and all 4 ambients correctly. So even just after 40, it's doing pretty good. And we're going to go to 200 just to see if this thing plateaus out. It's already at 50. See, on a crappy 4-year-old laptop, it doesn't take so long, right? No GPU. And how far along are we? Already up to 182. Okay, and we're only going to do 200. We're almost done. And look at this. It's a perfect score after 180. All right. That's actually pretty good. Okay, so this just turned blue. And the other thing I wanted to point out in here before we left it is all these checkpoint files. You know, when all we did was initialize the network, all we had was these 3 here at checkpoint 0. Checkpoint 0 meaning before the very first one. This is just how it was randomly initialized. But then we told it every 10 steps, we want to do a validation. And when it does a validation, it automatically saves a checkpoint as well. So say after you've been using SongExplorer for a long time, you've got tons and tons of data, and 200 training steps is just not enough because it usually, how long it takes to train is usually proportional to how much data that you have, right? As you accumulate more and more data, it might take several hours to train. And what if your computer crashes in the middle of it, right? Well, if you save checkpoints along the way and it crashes in the middle, you can just kind of pick up where you left off. All right, so we save a checkpoint every 10 steps here. And now we have that final checkpoint where the training is done and seemingly perfect. Okay, so that's kind of all text-based way to look at to see how things are coming along. But once things are done, we can make some nice fancy plots with this accuracy button. So click on accuracy. All it needs is the directory where all those logs are. Click on do it, and off it goes. Come back here. It creates a log file to store any errors if any arise. And the first thing to look at is this train loss curve. So this is as a function of our 200 steps, we can see that the accuracy goes up to where at the very end it's actually perfect in this case. That's usually not the case in the demo. Sometimes it's down around 90, right? So we kind of got a little lucky here. And the loss here is what the network used to update the weights. This is what gets back propagated into the hidden layer to change all the weights, right? That's not really something that you need to worry about unless you're kind of understand machine learning or want to learn kind of how it works. Really, otherwise what you need to pay attention to is these blue and this red curve. It also spits out the confusion matrix for you. We throw in an other category here because that's going to be important when we fix false positives. But we don't have anything annotated, and that's why these squares are all white. Sorry, that's so small. Let me blow this up. It's really this top 3 by 3 that you need to look about, and you can see the only non-zero entries are right along the diagonal, so we did exactly perfect on that validation data set. All right. Okay, so the next step now, we have a trained model, all right, and we want to test it on a new recording to see if there's any false positives and false negatives, and if there are, we want to correct it. All right, we're actually doing this blazingly well, guys. It's only 2:30. This is about, yeah. I think we're going along a little faster here than Monday session because I'm now kind of rehearsed, right? And maybe you guys aren't asking as many questions either. I'm not quite sure. Please, if anybody's confused or not following along, don't hesitate to stop. We got tons of time, all right? Okay, so we're going to take this fancy new trained model that on the validation data set that we have so far got perfect score. We're going to test it on a new recording and see if it's still as good, all right? So this is how we do that. And I've been neglecting actually to kind of scroll along here, but in the documentation, there's a whole bunch of text, how to detect sounds, how to visualize those clusters, which we've already done, how to annotate, which we've already done, how to train a classifier, which we just did, right? How to quantify the accuracy, which we just did. So, I mean, if you've kind of forgotten stuff or don't remember, didn't take good enough notes during this tutorial, or for whatever reason, you can't find the recording, I'm pretty sure the recording's going to be posted online. You can always come back to this documentation here. Now we want to make predictions, all right? So we need to pull out a new wave file from inside the container. I shipped it with several precisely so that we could follow along for the entire tutorial. Now, if we look there, we can see that in ground truth, we have another folder with another wave file. Now, look at the difference here. This is taken in 2016. The file name here is just a date stamp, right? And this here was taken in 2013. So 3 years have passed. Nominally, it's the same rig, but it's probably a different microphone, but in the same experimental apparatus. But 3 years has passed. It's probably a different person who loaded the flies into the chamber, right? Maybe the equipment's been moved around a little bit. The room tone might be a little different. The echoes might be different. Who knows what's going on, right? So this is a little bit of a challenge because it's taken from a slightly different data set. So what do we need to do? We need to we're still making predictions, right? So we quantify the accuracy of our model, and now we need to take those 3 checkpoint files and convert them into a PB file, which is what Classify needs to do the predictions. It's kind of a funny little step that I wish you guys didn't have to worry about, but this is the way TensorFlow operates, okay? So it's really simple though, from accuracy to freeze, you don't have to change anything. It all stays the same, except for, actually, that's a complete lie, I'm sorry. You need to specify a checkpoint file. So we come back here and we go into trained classifier, train_1, which is where all those checkpoint files are. We go to the last one, because that's the one where the model is most trained. You can choose any of those 3. It doesn't matter which. It's just looking for the string CKPD-200. That's all it needs, right? So you put that into there, and then we freeze. And then if we go back here, and we look in train classifier 1, train, we'll see 2 freeze log files. And then if everything works in a minute here, we'll see a .pb file. That's going to be this guy. And it should be a few K, right? And this goes blue, so we know that worked. And now we're going to classify that new wave file we just pulled out. So we have to go find it, back to the ground truth data. Shouldn't there be a round 2? That's curious. Ground truth data, round 2. Why don't I see that here? That's really strange. I'm not sure why that worked, but okay, nominally that should have appeared in the list. It's the first time I've ever seen this happen. You select it, you put that into the WAV file, you hit classify, nothing of these needs to change, off it goes, and mix predictions. If we go back over here into round 2, now this is another one of those things, kind of like the PB file, that I really wish you guys didn't have to be exposed to. But making a classification is a 2-step process. First, what it does is it dumps the logits, which is the output of the classifier, into this .tf file. TF is just for TensorFlow. It's a text file. It's gargantuan because it's storing binary data as text, right? It's just the easiest way I could make things work. The next step, we're going to get a classify.to log file in here in a minute that'll take this log file dump, this text file here, and convert it into .wav files in binary format. All right. So if you notice your hard drive filling up because you're making lots of predictions and you need to delete some files, delete these .tf files because they're big and they just are a waste. Okay, here's that classify.to log file. This guy here, you can see that for a 1 megabyte recording, this TF file ends up being 8 times bigger. And now you can see that these sine, .wave, pulse, other, and ambient. Okay, so let's just look at these. SongExplorer currently doesn't have a way to look at probability waveforms in the GUI. Nobody's asked for it, and it doesn't seem to be crucial to get your job done, but I think it is informative to look at them, and maybe someday I'll add them if enough people pester me, or if maybe even just one person asks me that they want to kind of look at this inside the GUI, because I think it can be useful. Here's our recording. If we zoom in here on the y-axis a little bit, we can see some, well, the fly people in the room will know that this is sine song here, and this is about a pulse song, but we're going to zoom here in a minute. We're going to load up import. Nice thing about Audacity is that when you import, when you want to overlay some other traces, it takes you right back to the same directory, so it's easy to find. Now if we just kind of zoom in here. Okay, so now it's clear that these guys are pulses and this guy's sine song, and you can see that the pulse goes high exactly when there's a pulse. Okay, got that? And the sine goes high in the interpulse interval. Okay, and ambient is low here throughout. So depending on how you like to think about things, you might be unhappy that the sine goes high during the interpulse intervals, but at least it goes high and stays high during the actual sine song. Notice that it goes high and stays high, the sine song. Whereas it's pulsatile, but out of phase with the pulse probability during the pulse song, okay? So one of the things that you can do is you can add, if you don't like the fact that interpulse intervals is getting called as a sine, is you can add another label. You can add an IPI label, right? And that will then get rid of it. Or you can even do that automatically if you have dense pulse annotations, which is what we've done with our data because we know that they're dense. Okay, so this looks good. This is the validation data was 100% and the waveforms look reasonably good too. Maybe there's a little bit of screwy stuff here. There's nothing that's clearly high. So this stuff, whatever's happening in there is not a clear call because everything's hanging out around a half. It's neither 1 nor 0. But you know, this is just annotation of one recording and only about 100 annotations. So it's looking reasonably good. So remember, this too is annotating on one file from 2013 and making predictions on a separate file from 2016. So it's a different animal and a 3-year-old rig, 3-year different rig. So then we want to turn those probability waveforms into an ethogram where we discretize with threshold. And I failed to point that out to you before, so I should do so now. If you look inside your trained classifier, inside train_1 directory, in addition to that PB file and all the checkpoint files, we have these threshold files. And these threshold files are simply what you should save the threshold, what you should set the threshold to for each word, for each of the specified desired precision recall ratios. Remember in my talk, I described that you have a choice in terms of the ratio of false negatives, false positives, precision and recall. One of them is false positive and one is false negative. I can never get them straight unless I think hard enough. One of them has to do with false negative rate, the other has to do with false positive rate. And depending on your experimental design, having a false negative might screw you up more than having a false positive, right? And so you can kind of choose to set the threshold based on what you want your ratio of those two types of errors to be. And then SongExplorer will tell you for each word that you care about and what that ratio you want it to be is what you should set your threshold to, all right? And the ratios that it gives up here are, those threshold files are created when you do the accuracy button. And the ratios it concludes in those threshold files are whatever's in this box down here. And I actually didn't mean to do all three. Normally, you just pick one and go with that. I think I should probably change that default to just be one. But when we do that ethogram, we haven't done that ethogram yet, right? No, because it says classify over here. When you do that ethogram, whatever's in that threshold file, it'll do it for all three ratios that we got now and all 4 words. It'll make ethograms for that. Ethogram is always real quick. It's lickety split. And if we go back here now to our ground truth directory and into round 2, we'll see 3 now predicted files, okay, for the 3 different ratios of error types that we specified in this box over here. All right, so let's pretend that I didn't include those other 2 for now. Maybe just get rid of those and just focus on the one where we make an equal number of false positives and false negatives. And you can see that this format, file format, just like detected.csv and annotated.csv, very similar. The first column is the WAV file, start and stop ticks. Now it's predicted in the 4th column instead of annotated or detected. And then what it's predicted at to be, ambient, sine, pulse, whatever word you happen to have. All right. All right. So now that we have predictions, we want to go see if any of them are false positives. And if they are, fix them. All right. The idea here being that there's this notion of active learning in the machine learning community where it's most informative to a network to give it examples of things it's doing wrong than to give it more examples of things it's doing right. So since annotation is kind of a laborious process, SongExplorer's GUI has been designed to really grasp this active learning component fully and provide a very easy means to go look at mistakes and correct them. And that's what these next 2 wizards are all about, fix false positives and fix false negatives, okay? So with this fix false positives, all we have to do is take those predictions, put that into label types, which this wizard automatically fills in for you, right? And then run those predictions through the forward past the model, saving all the hidden state activations. Then we're going to cluster them and visualize them, and then just look and see if any of those predictions are clearly examples of things that they shouldn't be, all right? So that's what we're going to do here. And this is maybe where we need to think about what we should put in these 2 boxes over here, the equalized ratio and the max samples. So let's go back and look here to see what we have in our ground truth directory. We still have our roughly 100 annotations and our roughly 1,700 detected events. And now we have about 3,000 predicted events. And there's about a 3-to-1 ratio between ambient and pulse and sine. So it's not huge. The set sizes are roughly the same. So we don't have a whole lot to be concerned with here, except for the fact that if we also cluster with the predicted as kind of recommended, we only have 10 of these guys. And so still, again, we probably really don't care that much about equalizing the ratios. It's really important, only important to have roughly equal set sizes when you're doing the completely unsupervised approach that I showed at the very end of my talk, where you don't have any annotated events at all, and you just have detected events in multiple different species or hybrids or whatever. If you want to kind of see things, how things cluster out there, you don't want just a few examples of one of your classes, because then you're going to miss it. And so it's very important to have equal size classes. But in this particular case, it's not important. So we're going to pump this up to 100. And I'm going to make this, I think since this is a tutorial and we don't want to sit around and wait too long, I'm going to leave this at 1,000 and we'll just leave it there. I think this computer is capable of a little bit more, but it might take a little while. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to take pulse, sine, ambient, and other that have been annotated or predicted, and it's going to take 1,000 of them total. All right, so what's that mean here? Pulse, sine, ambient, or other that have been annotated or predicted. So that's this box, this box, this box, this box, this box, and this box. We're going to take those 6 categories and we're going to go cluster them, all right? And we're going to see how things look. Okay, so what's happening here over in our file directory is that these 3 activations files have now been overwritten, okay? So what we did before maybe is no longer relevant anymore, and that's why I just had it overwrite. But you should be aware that the activation buttons always just puts it in the same place, and that's where your ground truth directory is pointed to. So if you want to keep something, you need to move it somewhere else if you decide to do a new activation. Come on, you're killing me. Turn it back on. Okay. And then you just go straight into a cluster, right? You're going to take that activations.npz file, which just stores all the hidden states, and we're going to cluster those guys. Again, oh, but now see I screwed it up. We're going to use UMAP, but this time we want to do all three layers. So we're going to have to wait for this to get done and then do it again. Yeah, okay. Yeah. The only way to kill this is to kill SongExplorer. Maybe that would be just worth showing you. So over here in the window where we started SongExplorer, oh, look, we have a big error message. Okay, let's ignore that for now. But Docker is running, right? And you can't just Control C out of this like you can most other programs. You just can't Control C. So what you have to do, remember in the beginning when we installed, I had you creating an alias called Docker kill. That's what we have to run right now, Docker kill. You have to open up a new terminal window and say Docker kill, and I think that should work. Oh, but look, it just finished. And it seems to still be running. Huh. Nominally, Docker kill should work. The other way to do that is if you go up here and into your dashboard. If you need to kill it, if for whatever reason Docker kill doesn't work, I'm not sure why that didn't just work. You can see we have in our Docker dashboard, we have all these instances of our SongExplorer running. Each one of these is associated with a different job we ran. So when we did a train, one was spooled up. When we did activations, another one was spooled up. When we did a detect, each time you do an action, a thing is spooled up and it'll come listed as exited. There's only one running because that's the one that's running a GUI. So if you start some process and you're long running and you realize, oh, I made a mistake and I need to kill it because I need to change some parameter, come back here, look for the one that's running, and then kill it with a delete button. And then you can start over again, all right? That's the way to do that. Okay, but it already finished. It didn't take that long. And now we need to redo it with the hidden layers included, because this is where it gets interesting. You're going to see things nicely separate out, at least you should. Just takes a minute for this guy. Any questions while we wait? It shouldn't be too long, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, I have one question actually. So what you've been showing so far has been with different sound types within a single animal or organism. Can you use this also to look across different organisms and see if there's differences across, how would I say this? Like, would you just have to combine the wave files of multiple samples and then run them through this to see if there's differences? Does that make
For
sense?
sure. By organism, you mean species or individual?
For my case, I'd be like mice, basically. I have like 5 or 6 different mice, and I have sound recordings from them.
So this is recordings from 3 years apart that we're doing now, and flies only live a month. So this is definitely a different individual for the 2 recordings we have now.
Yeah, but what I mean more is when you're using this sort of visualization, you're sort of separating them on the different sounds that they're. How do I say it? I'm wondering basically if, as like an end goal, if I made this UMAP, could I see like 5 different groups where I see each different mouse is from a different group? Does that make sense?
Oh, you want to do an individual, a person detector?
Yeah. So
Not a
in
person,
that
but a mouse
case, do I
detector.
have to combine these wave files together?
Well, what you would do is then you would just label your sounds as mouse number 1, mouse number 2, mouse number 3, right?
Yeah.
And then you train up a classifier, and you should be able to see things segregate that way.
I see. But what I mean is, would I have to basically combine the wave files together into one instance? Because otherwise, if I just run one wave file, it'd be all mouse number 1, right?
I mean, your files are currently different wave files already, right? For the individuals? Yeah. No, you could just leave them as separate wave files and then just do a detect sounds on each one.
I see.
And then just like I showed you how to do with species in my presentation, and then instead of label it with a species, you label it with the name that you gave that mouse. I imagine you don't give cute little names to your mouse, but probably some ID number, right? But yeah. And then you could just proceed like the same workflow that I showed at the very end of my talk, where you make an individual detector, and then you could look for personality differences between the mice to see if they have different vocalizations. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Okay, so we'll proceed. The cluster is finished, and now we just go to visualize like we did before. This doesn't actually launch a job, so the status bar will stay the same, but the do it button stays orange for a little while. And if we then go look at, well, let's go to the interesting part first. Let's look at the hidden layer number 2, and we can look at predicted, and we can see how everything segregates, right? So these guys up here are all sine song, have been predicted to be sine. These guys have all been predicted to be pulse. These guys have all been predicted to be ambient, right? We can see in that same space how the annotated events overlap. So the pulses are kind of down here, mix of sine and pulses up here, mostly ambience over there. That's for the annotated. It kind of recapitulates how things are over here, right? But then the idea is you click in here, right? You go examine things. And let's go down here first. We'll get to that in a second. You click here. These are nominally all labeled pulse, predicted to be pulse. That's what the text is here. And you can look at 100 at a time, a 10 by 10 array. You can just look at 100. And you say, in this quick view, does anything appear to be a mistake? And, you know, even to my relatively untrained eye, because I'm not the actual biologist here, right? Those all look good to me, right? And then you sample, you know, space over here. Oh, and look, okay, now we got a couple things that look a little bit funny. So we kind of go down here and look at the waveform, and there's this funky sound in here. I'm not really sure what that is, and what this little particular portion of it is, I'm not sure either. But you can see this particular portion over here has been predicted to be ambient, and so is all these guys, and so is this. But this thing hasn't been predicted to be anything. So none of those probability waveforms, none of the four, pulse, sine, ambient, and other, have exceeded the threshold, right? Except in this little tiny space right there. So now the question is this is clearly a mistake. It's not a pulse, but I don't know what it is. So I can't really label it as anything that I feel confident it is, at least not me. Maybe some of the fly song people we have in here could say what that was and we could label it properly, but I don't. And so I'm going to leave that alone, even though I know that's a mistake. It's been labeled pulse, and I know for sure it's not a pulse, but it's something else, but something I don't know what it is. And I guess one of the things you could do if you really wanted to label it is you could create that other class and say this is other. Or maybe if you happen to know what this thing was and you wanted to label that whole thing and include it as that. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that you should only label the things that are obviously wrong and you obviously know what the right answer is. And in this case, I don't know what the right answer is, so I'm going to leave that alone. We got another couple of funny things looking here. Actually, that looks like a decent pulse to me when zoomed in. This guy. So this guy, what's probably happening here is, remember, we got a 200 millisecond long context window, and it sees these three pulses and is extrapolating and say, ah, I bet there's another one here. That's probably what's happening here, because if we zoom in here, maybe it doesn't quite, there might be a very faint pulse there, but it's kind of hard to see. So I'm going to leave that one alone as well, because it's not an obvious example of something that's wrong. We can go check out these ambients too then. Most of these guys look okay. This guy actually looks like it might be a little bit sinusoidal, right? Might be able to see hints of a sinusoid in there. So what you could do then is go back and lay down sine song right here, right? Maybe this guy looks a little bit sinusoidal. Oh yeah. I would call this sine song as well. Let's go pan around. No, that looks good. Okay, and then this I wanted to say for last because we need to make a decision here what we want to do with these interpulse intervals. Are we happy calling them sine or do we want to call them something else? And let's just, for pedagogical purposes, say we don't like them called sine and we want them called IPI. And in that case, you can really easily just go in here and lay down some labels, right? Really fairly easy to do. But I see. The other thing I want to mention here is that you shouldn't go after things that have no predictions, right? So for example, this area over here is clearly sine song, but it's not predicted to be such, okay? One of the reasons may be that we only clustered 1,000 things and we have 3,000 predictions. So it could be the case that there's a prediction that's made there, but because of the limitations of how powerful our computer is, we just can't cluster everything. So in the interest of saving keystrokes and your time, don't do anything with this. It's clearly sine. It's possible that it hasn't been predicted to be sine, but go after the things that has been predicted to be something else at this stage of the game, right? Where it's a clear mistake. Okay, so yeah, clearly all these guys here, we can just go label as IPI. Yep. And we'll just do a few of these and then retrain another model. Oh, see, now there's a sign that's actually been predicted to be sine. Yep. There's another one, but then we got more IPIs. Okay, any questions about this stage? there's actually not a whole lot that's been predicted to be signed. It's been mostly IPI. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means that these IPIs are so short compared to normal sign that I think they're just drowning out in terms of the number of occurrences. What did I do there? Okay. Yeah, so another 40-ish annotations. Maybe we'll just do a few more for good measure of these IPIs. Okay. Okay, so just as before then, if you go back and look at your ground truth, right, we're going to have a annotated.csv file with a new timestamp. And if we look inside, it's the same as before. You know, wave file, start tick, stop tick, the label type, and then the word. Okay, and this time we've got a whole bunch of IPIs and just a couple signs. I guess I labeled sign, I don't quite remember now. And right, so we've kind of completed this workflow. We've fixed some false positives, and we now want to go back and make some predictions on a third wave file, right? So we now have two wave files. One we did detections and annotations, and the next we did predictions and fixed false positives. Now at this stage in the game, we're going to retrain the classifier and pull a third wave file out of the container so that we can fix false negatives. All right. So first we need to train another classifier. So we'll call it train2. It's still in ground truth, and all this other stuff stays the same. Notice it is now automatically stuck in there IPI for me and reverted back to just annotated. And we'll train up a classifier. While that's training, we will go back here. So correcting false alarms, correcting misses. Yeah, so it hasn't given us the nice thing here. We need to go back and create another one of these guys. And we're going to do an LS on this. So we're going to get really hard here, and we're going to pull out a wave recording from a different strain. The first two were both from Cantonese, which is a strain of melanogaster, and this is from Antigua. So this is going to really kind of challenge Deep Song's ability to generalize. See how well it does. Okay, now we got round 3 in Antigua, and back over here. It's still training. We can go check up on it. Trained classifier 2, trained log. Okay, it's a third of the way done. Any questions while we wait for this? Is that a kitty cat? All right. The reason I came into work today instead of doing this from home is we adopted a kitten a month ago. He's only 4 months and he wants to play all the time, constantly jumping in my lap while I'm trying to get work done. And I keep trying to explain to him that somebody needs to go to work so we can buy food, but he just doesn't understand. Always wants to play.
Mine is very affectionate. I wish we were allowed to go into campus.
On Monday, I wasn't used to the new security procedures we have on campus, and it took me 20 minutes to get through the gate. There was a whole questionnaire about have you had a fever or a cough, and you had to get a thing texted to your phone because they're doing essentially 2-factor authentication just to enter the building. And it's pretty nuts. Yeah. gone a little slower this time. We're still doing as many steps. Okay, well, I think we just have to wait a couple minutes here. There we go, turns blue. And again, we can look at the text-based, and it's all, with one exception, it's all along the diagonal. So it's still doing pretty good. Okay, so again, then we, to make predictions, we have to do accuracy again because we need those new thresholds. And it's also be nice to kind of look at the train loss curve while we're at it. There it is. You can see again, oh, we probably could have gotten by with just 100 steps. It looks pretty good. And then just to show you those, coming shortly here should be those threshold files. There they are. So these threshold files now contain, I changed it, so we're just doing the precision recall ratio of 1, and now that I have a threshold for IPI. And again, we haven't labeled anything other, that's why it's man, but you could. But the reason this is automatically included is because when we do our next step of fixing false negatives, we're going to have another class that's generated for us, and you'll see that here in a minute. Okay. I get the impression this is slower than last time around, but maybe I was explaining something else. Yeah, all we really need is this threshold for 200 checkpoint. And that all looks good. Okay, well, as soon as that's done, then we can go on to freeze. We'll just wait for this guy to turn blue. And yeah, notice that we need a new checkpoint file for our new snazzy new classifier. So we dial into train_1.r. And then we scroll all the way down and we get the checkpoint 200 file. We put that here. Yeah, I could have also just edited this text box. That might have been easier. Now that it's blue, we can go on and freeze that checkpoint. And that'll end up again with a couple log files here. And then the final output that you really need is this PB file. And then we can classify, and we need to go find that Antigua. There it is. And then everything else stays the same. Yep, we just do it. And again, this is a two-stage process. First, we create a gargantuan.tf file, which is text, and then we convert that into binary.wave files. This is about where I we got to our time limit in the Monday session. So we have another 45 minutes. So we'll get a little farther than the last group. Should be good. Okay, there we are. We're done. We won't look at them this time. I already showed you them in Audacity before, but again, just the output is we have sine.wave, pulse.wave, and ambient.wave. And then again, same as before, we make an ethogram. And I forgot to mention it last time, but nominally classify, freeze, classify, and ethogram all share the second row right here. And you notice that the thing that's described that once changes. So ethogram wants a threshold file, classify wants a PB file, freeze wants a checkpoint file. But all it is really looking for is a string with a string with the letters CKPT dash and a number in it. So you can, when you go from freeze and you put in a checkpoint file to classify, you could actually go back into the file browser and dig up a PB file, right? But that PB file will have in it CKPT-200, which is all that it really classify really needs. So you can just leave it as is and not go back, worry about updating that. Similarly, when you go to ethogram, it really wants a threshold file, right? But the threshold file, if you were to go properly into the file browser and dig it back up and find that thresholds dot CKPT-200 dot whatever, right? You could put that in here, but again, all it's really looking for is the string CKPT dash and then a number. And so as long as you're proceeding in a linear order from left to right here in the workflow that has been kind of laid out for you, you don't really need to change this. You can save yourself a step. It's the same with this third row here. Classify and ethogram both use that third row. Classify asks for a WAV file. Ethogram wants the TF file, but they both really just need that prefix, okay, and the full path without the prefix. And so you can give both either, and it won't matter. So save yourself a step and just leave it as is, and you'll be a little more productive. It's not something that's documented, but it does work. And I was kind of hoping that the fact that it's in the same place visually in the GUI, and that's all that's changed is the label, people would kind of clue in that that's possible. But since we're here in a tutorial, I figured I should explain that. Okay, so ethogram is done in blue. It's always lightning quick. We can go take a look at it. We can see that now only one predicted CSV file is made, and that's because we changed PR ratios here to just be one number when we did the accuracy. And if we look inside again there, just as again, to drill this into you, it's the same format as all the others. And once we have that, now we have a new set of predictions. And where we were last time at this point, we went to fixed false positives. But since we've already done that once, let's go to fixed false negatives and see if there's anything there. Of course, the other workflow is every time you make a set of predictions, you can fix false positives and fix false negatives on each. But for pedagogical purposes, I just decided to just do one on each, all right? In my experience, you noticed when we fixed false positives, really the only thing it got wrong was the IPIs, and that's simply because we hadn't labeled them. Pretty much everything it predicted, it had gotten right, with the exception of those IPIs. In my experience, that's pretty common the case. You're very rarely, at least early on, going to be fixing any false positives. What you really spend a lot more time on is fixing false negatives early on. It'll simply miss stuff. Okay. So the fix false negatives workflow is, it works like this. Think about how do you do that? How do you take a predicted file and you figure out what it missed, right? You have a set of predictions. Those will tell you where it found things, but how do you found stuff that it didn't predict and it missed? So the logic here is what you do is you do a detect on the same file that you just made predictions on. That'll give you a CSV file which shows you where all sounds are, everything that's above a certain amplitude threshold, right? Then you take that CSV file and you say, show me where there's detected sounds, but no predictions. And those are your misses. Those are your false negatives that you have to go and fix. All right. So we've already got the predicted file from the Make Predictions wizard, which we just finished. Now we're in fix false negatives. And the first thing we need to do then is detect sounds on that same WAV file that we just made predictions on. All right. And again, if you're kind of following the wizards and going through the actions in this same canonical order, everything's already filled in, right? We've already got that antigua.wav file in here. Our settings are going to be all the same as when we detected sounds when we were first making our first set of annotations at the very beginning of this tutorial. So this is all going to stay the same. And we just click do it. And off we go. We can come back here and we can watch this. Here's our detect.log in our round 3 subfolder, right next to our Antigua predicted CSV file. And this will just take a few seconds. Everybody understands the logic of taking sound intervals in time which have been detected to contain a sound but not have a prediction associated with them. And then we're going to cluster and visualize those periods of time. And if there's an obvious sound there, if there's a sound there that has a label that we care about and it's not labeled as such, then we're going to go label it. That's the idea, right? Okay, so now detect is done. And here again is that detected CSV file in the same format as all the others, right? And I click on misses. Misses now it switches to CSV files, and what it wants is it wants both those files, the detected and the CSV. And they can be in either order. You just click on one and then command click on the other. You've selected both now, right? Click in here, and now it just puts them both in with a comma to separate them. The predicted is here. And if we scroll all the way to the right in this guy, I think I can actually go like this. Here's the detected. So they both go in the same box. All right. And then we click on do it. Misses usually is pretty quick as well. Actually, you know, I should mention that lots of these things can actually take comma separated lists of files. So once you get a trained network, for example, and you want to make a classification of a file, you can actually put in a list of a whole bunch of files and it'll go off and do them all. You don't have to do them one by one. Similarly, if you want to detect sounds on a bunch of files, you can put them all in, comma separated, and it'll just do them all. And you can just walk away and come back, all right? I didn't really highlight that. I kind of forgot about it, but once you kind of get into the deeper thing, into the thick of things, and you're using SongExplorer a lot, that's kind of nice to be able to just set it in motion and go away. Okay, so now we have misses.csv, and that's right here in the same folder, round 3, right next to our detected and predicted. And again, it's this exact same format, except for this fourth column now says missed. And the fifth column says other. And that was why we've been including other as a label in the classifiers that we've been training. Because when we get to this point, we need to have an output tab that says other. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to stick these guys to the network and make predictions on them. All right. So now we do our activations, pulse sign, ambient, IPI, and other. Other is actually going to have now examples in there because as label types, we include annotated and missed. All right. And if we look down here, you can see missed. Wow, there's 3,000 missed intervals in this Antigua recording. All right. So there could very well be a lot of potential false negatives. And so we're going to classify everything in the annotated column and everything in the missed column together. And since we only have 14 signed, we got so many of these, I think we want to make, yeah, the equalized ratio is 100. So we'll get 1,400 of them, and then we're going to subsample it down to 1,000. Okay, so that should be fine. Yeah, all right. So there we go. Do it. Okay, taking its time. There it is. All right, and again, just to kind of remind you that now this is the second time that these activations files in the ground truth folder have been overwritten. Normally, if you're just kind of going through this, it's not really important to keep them because once you got new annotations and trained a new model, you don't really care about the predictions that are made with old models. That's kind of the philosophy behind just overriding them. Sometimes it's the case, though, that if I'm doing something special, I do want to keep these guys. And what I do simply there is just put them all. I usually keep the activations and the cluster all into a subfolder and just, call that, whatever, something interesting, right? Right. And then if you ever want to go back and look at it, you can always just take these guys and copy them back into the top level of your ground truth directory and redo a visualization and look. But typically you don't want to do that. That's kind of a special case. So the kind of the SongExplorer is just kind of written to automatically override them. So your disk space doesn't get filled up, but just keep in mind that there's kind of a way to work around it by shuffling some files around. All right. Oh, but now hold on. Those were, those are the very ones that we wanted to use in the next step. We're going to cluster on those guys, and we're going to cluster all 3 layers here, and off we go. So now this is kind of, while we wait, I'll kind of explain. This is kind of the step where we can do that hybrid approach I described, where, excuse me, we have a trained model and we're making predictions on another recording. It's the same species in this case, but a different strain. You wouldn't expect there to be a whole lot of differences in the vocalizations, but because we're doing a clustering with both the stuff we've annotated as well as the new stuff in this species, we might see in these clusters entirely new classes of sound that haven't been annotated before. This is kind of the workflow to get you that figure I showed in my talk, the first part of the second half. Except you wouldn't really want to do missed here if you wanted to do it properly, but rather just detect it and just include everything. So maybe that's then more of the false positive workflow is how you kind of do that. Okay, twiddle our thumbs. Here we go, almost done. There, all right, blue, and then we just visualize. Okay, let's see what we got. So here's where the annotated all breaks up. So these are the pulse, more pulses. These blue ones are the ambient. The green is the sign. I guess there's more green over here. And here's the IPI. So they're kind of segregated. There's not that many dots, so maybe that kind of hard to cluster. And then here's the mist. And what you can do is you can kind of click back and forth between these guys. And you can kind of look for where there's mist that have no annotations. Like up here. Notice there's no annotations up here. And yet in that same spot in the mist, we got tons of stuff. So it makes you kind of wonder what's that, right? Ditto for, well, I guess there's a little bit of stuff there. Kind of maybe in the central portion too, kind of look for hotspots. No, right here, in fact, there's a hotspot. If you hold your finger on your finger on the monitor right there, when we switch from annotated back to mist, look, there's a little hotspot of other right there too, right? So something here and something here is going on funny. So let's go kind of examine that and figure out what's going on. So looks to be a mix of sign and then like sign that's near pulses. So like here is a, okay, so that's going to be more like an IPI perhaps. And this is just a sign that it missed. But notice what's different about this sign. See the extra little wiggle? See the extra little wiggle there at the peak? That means there's a harmonic. It's not a pure tone. It's got a harmonic or maybe even a third or fourth harmonic. I'm sorry I didn't put the sonogram up, but we could probably see that in the sonogram. But as I recall, all the stuff, all the sign song we've labeled so far didn't have any little bumps like this. So maybe it was more of a pure tone where this is sinusoidal. So maybe that's going on with this example. These other examples are maybe not so clear. But anyway, the point is that here's something that's missed. And so we should label it as such. Label it with sign, right? Here's another something that's missed. So we can label that sign 2. Another something that's missed, but you know, not by much, right? Presumably the rest of this stuff has been labeled as predicted to be sign, and it's only not displayed here simply because we're only clustering 1,000 things and we had 3,000 things that were missed, right? You really got to keep that in mind. It's very tempting to go lay down a label here, but it's really not worth your time. Really, I strongly encourage you to just stick to the stuff that that's showing up as being missed and ignore the others, like this guy here. That's an IPI, right? Okay. And this guy's an IPI too. Okay, let's go check out this other spot. We had no annotations in this area of the cluster either. They all look like pulse. Where were the other pulses? Let me see here. Pulses, what color is pulse? Pulse is this black area here. So there's what the pulses look like that we annotated. And here's what the pulses look like that we missed. They might have a slightly lower carrier frequency. The peaks, the side peaks might be a little bit further spaced out. It's kind of hard to tell, but the point I'm trying to make here is that when you go annotate new things, whether it's a false positive or a false negative, it's kind of good to kind of spread them out through this entire space, because not only this space kind of represents the variability in your data set, and it's good to kind of capture all that variability by spreading your distributions out all over it. And these are kind of two areas which we had no annotations. So that's why I'm kind of focusing on them. All right, so let's go lay down some pulse annotations here. Oh, but see now, there's a couple in here that aren't labeled as being other, and I was just about to lay down a label. And you're so close here, you could, but again, I would advise don't even waste your time, because it's possible that it could have done it, and it's simply not being displayed because we've subsampled what we're displaying. Any questions on this? Okay, so we can rove around here, I suppose, a little bit more and look for other things. There's an IPI that it clearly missed. Here's some sign song. Okay, now one thing we haven't got any labels so far is other. Let's see, where's the, go back here and look for, where's the, I'm sorry, the ambient. There's pulse, sign. Okay, the ambient's way over here in this corner. So let's go look over there, see if it's missed any ambient. So remember, when we do a detect sounds, we have two thresholds. It's looking for things that exceed either the time or the frequency threshold, as well as things which exceed neither. And so when we do our missed, we're not only looking for loud sounds that have been missed, but we're also looking for ambient that has been missed. And so it's important to label that too, right? So here maybe is ambient that it has missed. Oh yeah, that looks like ambient right there. Maybe this guy too. Oh yeah, ambient. Okay, I don't want to belabor the whole point of how easy it is to annotate, because you guys have seen me do this enough today. One of the things you have to kind of decide is, you know, nominally in the limit, it's best to just make one annotation and then retrain, because that new model will nominally be better even with just one annotation. But it takes a little while to train, right? So you don't want to spend all your time training. So you have to find out what the right balance is. Well, how long do I spend annotating before I retrain, right? So what I've kind of been doing today is trying to get between 50 and 100 annotations, because it only takes a couple minutes to retrain. But as you collect more and more data, you'll find that those train loss learning curves, remember these guys here, you'll find that they won't saturate. They'll take more and more steps before they saturate, and then it takes longer and longer and longer to train. And that means maybe you don't just get 50 or 100 annotations that you make corrections on, but maybe a couple hundred or 500 or whatever makes sense, right? So you got to strike that right balance between how much do I use a given model and make corrections before I retrain, which takes a little while sometimes, and then make more predictions. Yeah. Okay, so here we've got another 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 annotations. And what we can do now is proceed into the tab that we didn't get to with the Monday session and test generalization. Now, we've kind of been doing that already because every time we've trained a new model, we've pulled out a new wave file and made predictions on it, right? See how well it generalized, right? But what we're going to do here is we're going to do it a little more systematically. We now have, let's go back to the, here, we now have in our ground truth directory, we have 3 sets of annotations. We've got this wave file with this set of, sorry, there we go. We have, sorry, right. We've got 3 rounds worth of annotations. We've got a wave file with annotations here. We've got a wave file with annotations here. And we've got a wave file with our hand annotations here, right? So what we can do is we can ask, if we train up a model with 2 of these guys and leave the 3rd one out and test the accuracy on those guys, we can train up 3 different models, each leaving one of these guys out, and then test on that one that's been withheld, right? Now, it might not work really well here because we have a really skewed distribution of, like in this guy, for example, there's IPI, ambient, pulse and sine. There's a little bit of everything. And this guy, we have, so this is where I screwed up. There's only IPI and sine, but it's still worth kind of going through. We don't actually have a great distribution of annotations in each of these files, but it's still kind of worth going through and showing you this workflow and how it works. The idea is that one of the things that machine learning models have problems with is generalizing to new data, right? Particularly if that new data, if there's something different about it. It was recorded with a different microphone, if it's of a different individual, if it was recorded from a different era, you know, like my voice from when I was a child versus my voice now after I've had whooping cough, right? Or whatever, right? Things change. And so neural networks can become too specialized on their training data set and fall into a little nook and cranny and overfit based on just what they've been shown. And so it's very then important when using your model to quantify and be aware of how well it can generalize to something different. And that's kind of what this workflow is all about. And it's the paradigm is called leave one out, where you have a whole bunch of recordings, you're going to leave one out, train on everything else, and then test on that thing that's been withheld. And then you're going to do that n times, 1 for every single recording that you have. And then you can kind of create a nice graph of how well it generalizes. Okay, so what we're going to do is click the emit one button here, and we're going to give it a, it's going to store all its log files in there. It's going to train up 3 models since we have 3 data files. It's going to look in ground, the emit one button looks in this folder, the ground truth folder, and for every single wave file it finds that has been annotated, it trains up a model. That's the way it works, all right? And, you know, to make this a little bit quicker, we're going to dial this down to 100 because we are going to have to train 3 models here. And why is it complaining at me? The red do it button is not red because why? I think I have to go like this. Yeah, that's it. All right. So the way this works is you have to tell it a ground truth folder, and then you have to tell it what subset of your annotated files you actually want to do this with. If you give it the ground truth folder again, it'll do it as I said just a second ago. It'll take every single wave file that's been annotated, leave it out, and train a model, right? So n models, 3 in our case. If you get it with we give it one of its subdirectories, say our subdirectory, say our round, each of our round 1, 2, and 3 subdirectories had multiple WAV files in it, right? We did, say, 5 WAV files in round 1 and another 5 in round 2 and another 5 in round 3. We haven't been doing that because we were in a hurry to get through the tutorial, right? But you could do that. Say you did that, and say that you only wanted to do this leave one out on just one of your rounds and not the whole thing, right? Then what you do is you'd say, in here you'd say ground truth data round 1, and it just leave out the WAV files that are there, all right? The other thing you can do is you can give it a text file here, and this is all explained in much more detail down here somewhere, right? You can give it a text file here that just has a comma-separated list of WAV files, and it'll just read that in and just do it to that. There's lots of different options. For the purposes of the tutorial here, we're just keeping it simple, and we're going to do everything we got because it's not that much to begin with. All right, so off we go. I made it a little shorter here, so it'll only take 300 steps instead of 2. It'll only take half again as long as what we've been normally doing. This is kind of one of the things where, you know, if you've got a really powerful computer, it can train all these models at once. It does it in parallel. But since this, as I've said, this is a crappy 4-year-old laptop and it only has 2 cores, we're going to have to do this serially. But while we wait for this, since it does take a little while, let me kind of explain how to set that up. So let's look in our configuration for generalize, okay? And you can see this group of things here, right? So notice that you've got the choice up here to use a GPU or not, all right? So this computer doesn't have a GPU, so I have it set to 0. But if you have a GPU, you should set it to 1, right? In my case, since we don't have a GPU, right, all these guys, number of CPU cores, number of GPU cards, and number of gigabytes of memory are all set to -1. By default, that's the way things are set up. And what that means is when generalizes runs, it assumes that it has the entire computer and nothing else is running within SongExplorer, right? However, if you happen to know that when your models train, they only take 3 CPU cores if you don't have a GPU, which is what I found to be the case with this model, right? You can set number of CPU cores here to be 3, right? And since I don't have a GPU card, I would say 0. And you would have to kind of go back and gauge how much memory it takes. I don't really remember how much memory training takes, but let's just say it takes a gigabyte of memory. You could change these values to be something like this, right? Then when SongExplorer starts, it's going to talk to this little scheduler that it has built into it. And it's going to say, hey, I'm running this generalized process, and each of the models I'm training only needs 3 CPU cards, no GPU cards, and 1 gig of RAM. And you have a fancy computer. You have 12 CPU cores and 32 gigs of RAM. So I can train all these 3 guys simultaneously, and I'm going to do it because I know I can, and it'll do it. But you have to set your configuration file up correctly, and you have to also then quantify how much your particular data, your kind of data, and your neural network architecture actually uses of all these resources. It'll be different. Like I said, for FlySong, if you're not using a GPU, you only need about 3 CPU cores and I think it's about a gig of RAM, okay? But if you're we're sampling at 5 kilohertz, right? If you're studying ultrasound and you're sampling at 200 kilohertz and your context window is not 200 milliseconds like FlySong is, but it's a second, then things will be entirely different. And what you're going to have to do is look at your computer and monitor, go into the job monitor, right? On a Mac, that's activity monitor, this thing here, right? You're going to have to go into here, and while it's training, you're going to have to look to see how many CPU cores are busy and how much memory it's using, and then you'll know what values to punch in to this configuration file, all right? So, but by default, to make things easy for people just getting started out, everything is set to -1, and so it only ever does one thing at a time. But as you kind of If you decide to commit to SongExplorer and start using it regularly and you get tired of waiting for it to finish, then you need to start using it in a more advanced mode and make those changes. Does that make sense? Okay, great. All right, so this thing is still thinking, and we can kind of go look to see where it is. So I guess I should explain the file format in here as well. Remember when we've used the train button, which also trains at models, everything has been dumped into train_1R. What that 1R means is that when you train, you actually have an option to do multiple replicates if you want. So some machine learning aficionados, what they do is they'll, with the exact same parameters and data and everything, they'll train up multiple models that have different random weight initializations and then see which one's better. Because depending on how finicky your data is and how well you've tuned the hyperparameters, some random initializations might actually do a lot better than others. I've spent enough time tuning my hyperparameters and that everything always comes out the same, and it seems to be a relatively easy problem. There's not that much difference in the accuracy scores with multiple replicates of doing the exact same thing, but that might not always be the case with your data and your models. And so when you're doing the train action, there's an option down here to train up multiple replicates. And what'll happen is you'll end up with multiple train_R directories. You'll have train_1, train_2, train_3, and then these log directories will also be in replicates as well. Omit1, what it's done is that workflow is also training up multiple models. And what it's doing is it's instead of calling them train, it's calling them generalized. And instead of using an R as the suffix, it's using a W for withheld. So here, the first recording is withheld, and here the second recording is withheld, and here the third recording is withheld, right? But these folders all have the same structure. You still got the checkpoint files that come in triplicates, right? These log files here all have the same structure. You've got all your hyperparameters up here. You've got your model architecture right here. You've got your train split down here, and you've got your steps and your confusion matrix. All that's the same, right? It's just that the top level folder and file names are a bit different because we're kind of doing a different task, all right? All right, so generalize is finished. And the next step in the generalization workflow is to compute the accuracy. And so we just click there and we do it. And off it goes. We come back here and we can kind of watch it through its thing. We're going to come up with a train loss curve just like before, as well as an accuracy.pdf that has confusion matrix. But we're also going to have a new figure that kind of plots the accuracy, the overall accuracy for each of these different models where one recording has been withheld. Actually, I want to kind of show you that in here, how that's done. Right, so you can see here where it says validation files is the 709 channel 3, right? And in this one, the validation files is the Antigua 210 channel 26, right? And in this one, the validation file is 314 channel 1, right? So for each one, it withheld a different one. And in that case, in this case, validate % is completely ignored because you're not taking a random percentage of all the files. You're taking the entirety of one file to use as the validation data. Okay, so let's see if this accuracy is finished. Yeah, we're left with a train loss curve. We get 3 of them, 1 for each model. We're only doing 100 reps now instead of 200. So maybe they didn't quite saturate, but they got pretty close, right? I was in a hurry, right? I didn't want to wait. And our confusion matrices, we get 3, 1 for each. This one is really blank clearly because there were no pulse ambient annotations in that file that was withheld because, like I said, I was complaining that we didn't really distribute our labels evenly across the 3 data sets. But then importantly, this one here, now we have a new graph over here where the number that's up here on each of those separate confusion matrices has now been just plotted down here. And for each file, you can see what the accuracy was, and you can see how well it kind of generalizes across all these different things. This doesn't look so great simply because, we didn't spend a very thorough time getting a balanced set of annotations, but you guys, I'm sure, will do it much more thoroughly when you're looking at your own data. And then you can kind of see whether, oh, hey, this particular individual, if I withheld him and train on everybody else, that I can't make decent predictions on this guy. And that'll kind of help you figure out how well you're doing. Okay, so we only have 6 minutes left. We could consider stopping here. Maybe what I'll just try to do, maybe I should ask if there's any questions first on anything in the last 4 hours. Big picture stuff, little picture stuff. Maybe if some of you have been trying to install it and kind of follow along and you're having problems, we could talk about that. Is there any question you want to get at before we're done? If there's not, maybe I can briefly describe the tune the hyperparameters workflow. We're not going to actually have time to do it, but I could kind of talk about how that's done if you wanted. If there were no other questions, but I think the priority really is to answer questions at this point because we only have a few minutes. So anybody have questions about anything? I will of course be accessible via email, and you guys are more than welcome to email me at any time. If you have questions offline and you're trying to get it to work on your data. I was with the other group, I told them I was going to be at GatherTown and on the Slack, the conference Slack channel to answer questions. Of course, the conference is ending this evening, so that's not much of an opportunity for you guys to catch me there, but anytime with an email is fine. Or in these last few minutes we have, if you want to ask now, if anything pops to mind, it's a good time. Okay, so either you understood nothing or you understood everything. That's great. Okay, so maybe I'll then just briefly describe how to tune the hyperparameters. Now, like I said, the architecture that we're using for fruit flies has 3 hidden layers, 8 feature maps, a 200 millisecond context window, and we're using the raw waveform dropout, a very specific learning rate of 1e-6, and a context window that's symmetric about the annotation, and what else? And the atom optimizer with the rectified linear unit nonlinearity. These are all decisions, what exactly to use, that you guys are going to have to make as well. These guys are probably a good starting point, but almost for sure they aren't the best thing for you to use. And so that's why eventually you need to go through this tuning the hyperparameters workflow. All right, and that's where we do cross-validation. So in the omit one for the test generalization workflow, we withheld as validation in one entire recording and trained a model on all the others. With cross-validation, what you do is you break down, you train multiple models again at the same time if you can, or sequentially if you can, and there you partition your entire data into usually it's like 8ths. You do down here, you specify like 8 folds. So you take all your data across all your recordings, all your annotations, you scramble them, shuffle them all together, and then you just divide them into 8ths. And then you train up 8 models, each that has a different 8th withheld to validate on. And then you train on all the others. So nominally you're training on all your recordings, but only 7/8 of each of the annotations on each recording. And you're withholding an 1/8 of each recording to test, to see how well it's done. And then with those 8 models, you start varying the various different hyperparameters that is itemized. The number of features. So like I said, in all of our production stuff, we use 8 feature maps. In this tutorial, we've been using 64. That's the kind of thing that you need to vary. So you train up a model that has just 2, another one that has 4, another one that has 8, another one that has 16, 32, 64, and you just draw a tuning curve and you pick the peak. Or if it keeps going up and getting better and better in one direction, you keep doing more in that direction, right? And you just find what is the best value for the number of features. Same with the number of kernels. Typically, we use 128 kernel size in our production FlySong stuff. For this demo, we've been just using 3 for the kernel size, but then that's another free parameter that you need to just try. And again, keep everything else fixed and then just vary this over a range, cross-validate 8 different models or however much time you have to wait, right? Look at the accuracy, see if there's a tuning curve, a peak, right, in the tuning curve. Choose that, fix that in place. Then try adding residual connections or getting rid of them if you'd had them there in the first place. See if that makes a difference. Vary the number of this thing here controls how deep the network is, how many hidden layers you have, whether you have, we typically use 2 in this example data set, but in production we use 3. Maybe 16 would be better, right? We tried it, it wasn't for us, but maybe for your data it is. You just need to do that tuning curve, try it out, and then keep kind of going through it. Once you go through all of them once, then maybe go back and again, because they might have interaction terms, right? If you change one, it might change the optimal value for the other one. This is kind of the thing that with experience, you kind of get a feel for what might be better, but when you're first starting out in machine learning, you don't have that experience, and so you just need to kind of try and figure it out and just do these tuning curves and learn. And so that's why it's very important. You could get radically better generalization to new data by choosing different hyperparameters. And it's something that the David Stern lab has spent a lot of time, in terms of me, all right, working for David Stern, has spent a lot of time finding the exact set of hyperparameters. And this is where a big workstation comes in really handy with a GPU card. Because like I said, if you have a GPU and your modules are fairly small, you can do all 8 of these guys on one GPU and then off it goes, right? Or if you have 2 GPUs in your box like Yoon Ding's lab has, or if you have 4 GPUs in your box like my computer has here, my workstation has, then you can go even faster, right? And the other thing is you don't need top of the line GPUs. If you decide to buy a workstation with the latest and greatest, my GPU and my workstation is a 980, which is 3 generations behind, right? You don't have to spend top dollar for the most recent model. You can get the next oldest model for, a third the price as the fancy ones, and it'll be fine. This is the benefit of having one-dimensional data. It's an easy problem, and you don't really need to spend a whole lot of money on compute. But if you do really find you like SongExplorer and you start using it a lot, I strongly recommend you spend a fair bit of time tuning the hyperparameters. And there, when you're trying to tune up, 4 or 8 models at a time, a GPU can really help a lot there. And so it's a couple minutes after 4, so we should probably quit. I know I don't know if you guys have another session to go to tonight or anything, but I'm kind of done with the conference, and so I might hang out in Gather Town and socialize for a little bit until I go home. I'm not sure when that's going to be, but I'm happy to hang out here if any more questions popped up in your head. Otherwise, shoot me an email. Like I said, I'm super excited that if even one of you started using SongExplorer, I would be ecstatic. It would be really exciting. It would make my day. Yeah. So.
Maybe I have a question, because our data, there are no like in a range of seconds or even minutes. Like the recordings are, shortest time are 5 minutes, but the whole recording is, let's say, days, because the sounds the turtles produce, they produce, I don't know, in an hour 6 sounds, something like this. So it's pretty a big time frame.
Yeah.
Is it even possible to work with data in SongExplorer and some reasonable hardware setup?
What's the sampling rate that you have? Turtles aren't
Something
ultrasonic
like
or anything, right?
of the microphone.
Yeah. What's your sampling rate?
I don't know. I don't know now. Well, it's just an ordinary recorder with a ordinary microphone. So I would say not really something.
They're
So the
not.
sounds
I guess they're
are
not ultrasonic, is what I'm
normal.
asking.
No.
Okay. All right. I mean, so that'll help a lot, right? That the fact that they're just in the normal audio range, and
Right.
you say the problem is that your recordings are really long because they sing so rarely.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't have a lot of examples in one recording.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly when you're running detections and classifications on these guys, will take a little bit longer because you have to read in the whole file and process it, right? But when you're kind of manually annotating things by hand, you're going to zoom in to just where there's a sound. And so you as the person don't have to pan through kind of the entire thing looking for stuff. The GUI is going to guide you to where the interesting stuff is. So your computer might have to think a little while, but it's that's just a matter of patience on your part. I think you can just need to push the button and wait for it to come back. So I'm not sure I can give you a whole lot of guidance. You said it was days? Is that what you said of recordings? That's how long a recording is?
Yeah, like the recording session is a day. Yeah. So,
Okay.
but we have divided in. So the recorder always starts a new file after. Sometimes it is 5 minutes, sometimes it is 15 minutes, but like these
And
duration.
this is in a field or it's in the lab?
It's in a zoo.
It's in a zoo. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would have to say it shouldn't be so bad since you're sampling at a decent rate. You're not at, some of the bat people sample at 500 kilohertz, right? So, and the mice guys are typically up, at 200 kilohertz, maybe something like this, right? But you're going to be down maybe at 20 kilohertz at most, I would think. So that's a lot less data than these guys have, even though you have much, much longer recordings.
Mhm.
I suppose I could try to time it for you, how long it takes to do detection and predictions. I don't think it's any slower than real time. I think it's
Yeah.
faster than real time. But I, to be honest, I don't really keep track. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't answer the question. Yeah.
Well, I'll try and I'll see.
Yeah, I'll try it with what you have, and then if it's not good enough, yeah, try to. You might have to buy a fancier computer, I guess, right? Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Everybody's sticking around. There must be a question in there somewhere, huh? We only lost one person, maybe two.
So not a question, but yeah, before leaving, I wanted to say that it's really, really cool. I really like the interface, and yeah, it was a pleasure to listen to the talk. Now I also have to go.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the feedback. I appreciate it. You're muted, Justin. I can't hear you. There you go.
There we go. I don't know why that keeps happening. But yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, Ben. This was really great. I'll definitely shoot you an email as I'm kind of working with it myself.
Yeah.
Probably especially about like tuning the H parameters, hyperparameters.
Okay, yeah, that's something we didn't have. Well, for you though, you should be able to use the stock stuff, right?
Yeah, so I definitely should. Yeah. So
you shouldn't have to mess around with that at all. I've spent days and days and days doing that for you.
yeah,
should be
thank
fine.
you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Ben. I'm gonna
Okay,
head
we'll
out.
see you around. And I imagine we'll probably meet sometime since
Yeah,
you're
I
with
would think
Yoon
so.
and yeah, right. So,
Yeah, I hope so at least.
all right, good. All right,
All
take
right,
care.
I'll see you, Ben. Thanks
Happy
again.
holidays. Yeah.
Happy holidays.
Thank you and bye.
All right, bye guys.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah.